The 9,378th meeting of the Security Council is resumed. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Dominique Hser, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Liechtenstein.
Mr. President, it is my honor to address the Security Council today on a topic that is particularly dear to me. The Women, Peace and Security agenda, including the protection and support of victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, is a priority of Liechtenstein's foreign policy, and I am personally committed to the cause. As a result of escalating violence, militarization, and weakened rule of law protections, civilians bear the brunt of armed conflicts across the globe. Sexual violence is used as a weapon of war to attack civilian populations and to break societies, communities, and families. Such violence is documented in virtually every conflict worldwide, including in Myanmar, Ukraine, and Yemen. All these situations require the urgent attention of the respective accountability mechanisms. In the case of Ukraine, we will in particular be looking for expeditious investigations by the International Criminal Court. I also wanted to highlight our appreciation for the briefing this morning of Hser, which reflects her tireless advocacy on behalf of the women of Myanmar. We are pleased to see the Security Council pass Resolution 2669 last December. Given the worsening situation on the ground, we believe that it is now time for the Council to seriously consider a follow-up text that will bring accountability for the crimes committed in Myanmar, including conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, all acts of sexual violence are not only morally repugnant, they are categorically prohibited under international humanitarian and human rights law. They constitute war crimes and may amount to crimes against humanity and genocide. Concrete, time-bound preventive measures, as explicitly outlined in Security Council Resolutions 2106 and 2467, are necessary to bring an end to these atrocities. We reiterate our call on the Council to include conflict-related sexual violence as a designation criterion in targeted sanctioned crimes. Such measures are in line with a complementary to the Act Code of Conduct regarding Security Council action against genocide, crime against humanity, or war crimes. The Code of Conduct is now supported by 129 states, including the majority of this Council's membership. Although widespread and often systematic sexual violence against men and boys remains underreported due to stigma, cultural taboo, and lack of criminalization. As a result, male survivors of sexual violence are often unable to access legal remedies as well as medical and mental health services. The pioneering work by the Liechtenstein-based international NGO All Survivors Project has helped to advance awareness through tireless advocacy. Its work has informed Security Council Resolution 2467, which has paved the way for strengthened accountability in this regard. This Council should consistently call on states to live up their obligation to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence in line with the primacy of national systems. The international justice system must be engaged where national systems fail due to inability or unwillingness. Mr. President, international criminal justice mechanisms have significantly advanced our efforts to fight impunity. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the 25th anniversary of which we celebrate on Monday, has played a vital role in ending impunity for sexual violence crimes. It is the first international criminal law instrument that explicitly recognizes forms of sexual violence, such as rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, and enforced sterilization, as distinct war crimes and crimes against humanity. It urges states parties to appoint judges with special legal expertise on gender-based violence and requests the court to provide special protections to victims, including with regard to age and gender. In practice, the ICC has done pioneering work to hold perpetrators to account by establishing a comprehensive and victim-centered framework. It has firmly established conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence as crimes against humanity and war crimes. We commend the Office of the Prosecutor for including charges related to sexual and gender-based crimes in many of their cases and for prioritizing these crimes as a matter of policy. The case of Boskundanga resulted in a milestone verdict as sexual violence crimes committed against males were held to the same standards as those committed against females. The ICC's judgments against Dominique Ongwen also succeeded in painting a comprehensive picture of sexual and gender-based crimes suffered by victims and constitute important precedent for the future cases. Dedicated gender expertise in investigative teams, including our partners from Justice Rapid Response, is crucial for the ICC and other regional and international accountability mechanisms in this regard. Mr. President, no person should ever have to go through the terrifying and traumatizing experience of conflict-related sexual violence. We must therefore redouble our efforts to prevent its occurrence. At root, this means combating structural gender inequality and promoting the participation and leadership of women in public life. By ensuring women's rights to full, equal and meaningful participation, we contribute to the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence and to the health of our society as a whole.
Her Excellency Ms. Hser for her statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you. Mr. President, Poland thanks the United Kingdom for convening this important debate and for its efforts to advance the implementation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We also thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive report on the issue and lend our support to the mandate and activities of SRSG, Pramila Patten. Poland aligns itself with the statements of the EU and WPS group of friends. The use of sexual violence as weapons or tactics of war is widespread. Conflict-related sexual violence remains a significant global concern, affecting primarily women and girls, but we should not forget to account for the male victims as well. Poland stands in solidarity with all victims and survivors and calls for greater support that encompasses recognition of their suffering, elimination of stigma, provision of medical and psychosocial assistance. Impunity and the lack of accountability have allowed conflict-related sexual violence to persist. By holding perpetrators accountable, we can send a powerful message to victims and survivors that their voices have been heard, and to offenders that the days of empty warnings are over. Poland emphasized the significance of women's participation in processes aimed at addressing sexual violence, including peace talks. Female negotiators can ensure a survivor-centered approach, facilitate the rehabilitation of survivors, secure post-conflict reparations, promote accountability, and establish vetting mechanisms to exclude perpetrators from security forces. We support peacekeeping and monitoring missions to provide adequate protection for all victims. In this vein, we endorse the deployment of Women's Protection Advisor and the use of early warning indicators to address conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, as a neighbor of Ukraine, hosting currently the largest community of Ukrainian refugees, Poland condemns the deliberate use of sexual violence by Russian soldiers as a tactic of war and intimidation. We welcome the reference to these appalling practices in the report. The massive displacement caused by Russian aggression has heightened the risks of all forms of sexual violence. In response, Poland has swiftly implemented new measures to support Ukrainian citizens seeking refuge in our country that SRSG Patten kindly referred to in her briefing. Since the consequences of CRSV extend beyond the physical dimension and have lasting impacts on survivors' lives, effective prevention and multisectoral response mechanisms are crucial in post-conflict settings. Mindful of this, Poland's Ministry of Health has initiated an intensive therapy pilot program aimed at providing trauma treatment for women survivors in conflict and post-conflict environments. Mr. President, accountability is essential to ensure compliance with international obligations. Failure to take decisive action will only encourage further abuse. Consequently, Poland actively assists the International Criminal Court in collecting evidence of war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. To this end, we have established a joint investigation team with Lithuania and Ukraine. Additionally, the Rafael Lemkin Center for Documenting Russian Crimes in Ukraine has been established in Warsaw. Its purpose is to gather and preserve evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as record witness testimonies. There are numerous unreported cases for each one that comes to light. We have a moral obligation in support of the courageous survivors who have come forward, as well as those who have been silenced by fear. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statements. Colleagues, let me remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. Flashing lights on the collars of the microphones will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. Now, I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. بداية أود أن أتقدم بجزيل الشكر للمملكة المتحدة على تنظيمها لهذا النقاش حول موضوع حساس جدا لا يزال يأخذ أبعاد خطيرة نظرا لتشعب النزاعات المسلحة وما يكتنفها من أعمال وحشية ولا إنسانية تستهدف خاصة النساء والفتيات. حيث أجدد إدانة بلادي الجزائر وبشدة لكل أشكال العنف الجنسي ضد النساء والفتيات في كل تجلياته وصوره وفي جميع السياقات، ذلك أن مثل هذه الممارسات مرفوضة تماما ولا مكان لها في عالمنا حاضرا ومستقبلا، إيمانا منها بأهمية محاربة جميع أشكال العنف لا سيما ما استهدف النساء والفتيات. قامت الجزائر بالتصديق على جميع الاتفاقيات الدولية الرامية إلى مكافحة العنف ضد النساء، وذلك من أجل الاستجابة لتطلعاتهن وإرساء الثقافة والقيم التي من شأنها محاربة جميع أشكال تهميشهن مع ضمان مشاركتهن في التنمية المستدامة. كما كانت الجزائر من السباقين لتطوير استراتيجية وطنية لمكافحة العنف ضد المرأة والفتاة منذ عام 2007 تشمل على 3 مجالات: تدخل الخدمات المناسبة والمتنوعة، تعبئة المجتمع والتضامن الاجتماعي والوطني، وبناء التحالفات. وتماشيا مع هذه الاستراتيجية يتم تنظيم دورات تدريبية دورية للقضاء والدرك والشرطة من أجل ضمان التنفيذ الفعال لها. بالإضافة إلى ذلك تم تحيين القوانين بما يشمل حماية المرأة من كافة أشكال العنف مع وضع عدة آليات ردعية وحمائية يتم تنفيذها بالتنسيق بين المسؤولين المحليين للقطاعات والهيئات المعنية بالموضوع والحركة الجمعوية ووسائل الإعلام. كما تم تعزيز المنظومة التشريعية للحد من العنف ضد المرأة بما يعكس الإرادة السياسية لأعلى السلطات في البلاد، والتي تجسدت من خلال الدستور الذي خصص مادة تدين العنف ضد المرأة وتلزم الدولة على حماية المرأة في كل الظروف والأمكنة. سيد الرئيس، نحن هنا من خلال هذا النقاش العام نبحث عن تنفيذ الالتزامات والأطر القائمة، لا سيما تلك التي أقرها مجلس الأمن مثل ما هو مبين في تقرير الأمين العام S 2023 شارطة 413 وتوصياته القيمة المدرجة فيه. كدولة الجزائر ومثل ما أوضحنا عملت على وضع ترسانة قانونية وتنظيمية وسياسية قوية ومتكاملة لمكافحة العنف ضد المرأة والفتيات، وسنعمل داخل المجلس وخارجه على مكافحة هذه الظاهرة لا سيما في أوقات النزاعات من أجل عالم خال من العنف. كما نثمن عاليا الدور الذي تلعبه المرأة في حل النزاعات وتجاوز تبعاتها، حيث كان لصمود المرأة الجزائرية ومشاركتها الفعالة دور هام في مكافحة الإرهاب خلال التسعينات القرن الماضي، وبفضلها استطاعت الجزائر تجاوز هذه الآفة المدمرة. في في هذا السياق وبناء على تجربتنا الوطنية في مجال مكافحة العنف ضد المرأة، أود أن أؤكد على النقاط التالية. أولاً، ضرورة تحديد الأطر القانونية وتحيين التشريعات الوطنية وجعلها تواكب التحولات التي يعرفها العالم مع تعدد النزاعات وتغير شكلها، كما ينبغي جعلها موائمة لما تقره المجموعة الدولية لا سيما قرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة. ثانياً، أهمية ضمان تطبيق قرارات مجلس الأمن ذات الصلة، ذلك أنه على الرغم من عديد القرارات التي أقرها مجلس الأمن، وهذا من القرار 1820 إلى القرار 2467، يبقى العنف الجنسي شائعا في أوقات النزاعات المسلحة، مثل ما أوضحته التقارير المتعاقبة للأمناء العامين للأمم المتحدة. لذا يجب اتخاذ التدابير اللازمة التي من شأنها ضمان تنفيذ هذه القرارات من خلال تضمينها في ولاية عمليات حفظ السلم، وتشديد العقوبات على مرتكبي الجرائم، وتكوين قوات الأمن من أجل حماية النساء من أي عنف جنسي محتمل خلال النزاعات. ثالثاً، وجوب اعتماد مقاربة شاملة، خاصة وأن مهمة حماية المرأة من العنف الجنسي في أوقات النزاعات لا تقتصر على جهة معنية، بل تشدد على تضافر جهود كل الفاعلين بما فيهم مؤسسات الدولة والمجموعات الدولية والأمم المتحدة والمجتمع المدني، بهدف التأسيس لمنظومة تشريعية أمنية وقضائية قوية تحد من الظاهرة وتمكن من التعاطي الفعال معها. رابعاً، ضمان وصول ضحايا العنف الجنسي للعدالة في الوقت المناسب من خلال آليات تظلم فعالة وتدابير لرد الأضرار الوظيفية وعمليات التعويض الشاملة. خامساً، ضمان عدم الإفلات من العقاب، حيث أنه ومع الأسف ومثل ما أكده السيد الأمين العام في تقريره وأقتبس: في معظم السياقات ظل الإفلات من العقاب هو القاعدة. انتهى الاقتباس. لذا ومن أجل ضمان معاقبة كل من تسبب في العنف الجنسي ضد النساء، لا بد من تكريس مبدأ سيادة القانون وبناء مؤسسات وطنية قوية على مختلف المستويات، بما يحد من خطر تعرض النساء والفتيات للعنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاعات. سادساً، معالجة الأسباب الجذرية للعنف الجنسي المتصل بالنزاع، وهذا باتخاذ التدابير اللازمة لمعالجة الأسباب الهيكلية التي تجعل النساء في وضعية هشة وأكثر عرضة للعنف الجنسي خلال النزاعات، لا سيما الفقر وانهيار مؤسسات الدولة وانعدام التنمية، من خلال سياسات واعية تأخذ بعين الاعتبار احتياجات النساء وتعمل على تعزيز المشاركة الهادفة للمرأة في المؤسسات السياسية والتنموية والأمنية. سيد الرئيس، إن وضع حد للعنف الجنسي في أوقات النزاع هو أولوية قصوى وواجب أخلاقي وسياسي يقع على عاتقنا جميعاً، فمن غير المعقول أن تنتهك كرامة النساء والفتيات ونبقى عاجزين عن مواجهة الآفة ومعاقبة المتسببين فيها. كما أن أفضل الدفاع ضد العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاع هو تكوين مجتمع تسوده العدالة الاجتماعية وتكافؤ الفرص، تتمتع فيه جميع النساء والفتيات بحقوقهن وبحماية متساوية تحت القانون. شكرا على حسن الإصغاء.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, I thank the UK presidency for organising this debate and the distinguished briefers for sharing valuable insights. Croatia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union as well as groups of friends of women, peace and security and responsibility to protect. I would also like to add some remarks in my national capacity. As we mark the 15th anniversary of the Security Council resolution which condemned the use of sexual violence as weapon of war, the Secretary-General's report for 2022 shows that it still remains one of the most widespread human rights violations in conflict-affected countries. We must do everything we can to improve prevention, protect survivors, and punish perpetrators. In this regard, let me thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict for her tireless efforts. Mr. President, sexual violence in conflict is closely related to discrimination of women and sexual violence in peacetime. In many countries, impunity prevails due to reluctance to prosecute crimes of sexual violence. This adds to a number of crimes that have already gone unreported as survivors fear retaliation and social stigma. We strongly encourage all states to align their laws with international humanitarian and human rights law, especially the CEDAW Convention and CEDAW Committee jurisprudence, as well as monitor their compliance with relevant Security Council resolutions. Tackling structural gender inequality should be prioritized in times of peace in order to minimize its effects during periods of instability. We also need to focus on a survivor-centered approach. As an example of such practice, Croatian survivors of sexual violence suffered in the homeland war are entitled to financial compensation and psychological support, even if perpetrators were never identified nor brought to justice. Finally, we fully support the Security Council to use sanctions against all parties, including mercenaries and private military companies, to prevent the recurrence of conflict-related sexual violence. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Croatia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos al Reino Unido por la convocatoria a este debate abierto anual sobre violencia sexual relacionada con el conflicto, así como por las presentaciones realizadas. Si bien México reconoce los avances a partir de la resolución 1820 y resoluciones subsecuentes, así como la codificación de delitos sexuales como atrocidades en el Estatuto de Roma de la Corte Penal Internacional, lamentablemente estas violaciones al derecho internacional humanitario y al derecho internacional de los derechos humanos aún persisten o incluso se agravan en situaciones como las que imperan en la República Democrática del Congo, Etiopía, Haití o Sudán del Sur, como lo señala el más reciente informe del secretario general. En este sentido, México desea enfatizar 3 llamados a la acción. En primer lugar, es crucial garantizar el acceso a la justicia y a los servicios de salud. Ello incluye la salud sexual y reproductiva y la salud mental para víctimas y sobrevivientes. En contextos de conflicto, esto significa otorgar un apoyo holístico para facilitar la reintegración de sobrevivientes y asegurar que no exista impunidad. Es importante reconocer la importancia de la salud mental y el apoyo psicosocial, que responda a las cuestiones de género y que sea oportuno y suficiente, lo cual es necesario no solo para sobrevivientes, sino también para el personal de las operaciones de paz de la ONU. Hacemos un llamado a este Consejo para seguir avanzando en el marco de las disposiciones contenidas en la Resolución 2668. En segundo lugar, debemos apoyar el despliegue de asesoras de protección de la mujer en operaciones de paz y procesos de transición. Las asesoras de protección permiten prevenir atrocidades y otorgar una respuesta oportuna. Asimismo, es importante atender la discriminación en contra de las mujeres, la falta de representación y la carencia de servicios para las sobrevivientes, lo que agrava el impacto desproporcionado de la violencia sexual en mujeres y en niñas. Tercero, hace un año las presidencias de Irlanda, Kenia y México se comprometieron en este Consejo a hacer de la Agenda de Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad una prioridad. Desde entonces, las presidencias de 8 miembros del Consejo, incluyendo el Reino Unido, han suscrito una declaración de compromisos comunes sobre esta agenda. Instamos a todos los miembros del Consejo de Seguridad a continuar comprometiéndose con la agenda de WPS. Por otra parte, es necesario seguir avanzando en la recopilación y análisis de datos desglosados por género que permiten mejorar el entendimiento de las necesidades específicas y las formas múltiples e interseccionales de discriminación. En conclusión, señor presidente, México reafirma la importancia de atender la violencia sexual relacionada con el conflicto de manera preventiva y fomentar y asegurar la participación efectiva de las mujeres en la toma de decisiones. Muchas gracias.
Okay, for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Guatemala.
Gracias, señor presidente. Guatemala agradece al Reino Unido por convocar a este importante debate abierto, así como a la señora Pramila Patten, representante especial del secretario general sobre violencia sexual en conflictos, y muy en especial a Nadine y a Hser por las acciones que realizan para salvar generaciones futuras de este flagelo. Mi delegación se adhiere a la intervención pronunciada por el Grupo de Amigos de Responsabilidad de Proteger y en capacidad nacional quisiera destacar algunos elementos. La violencia sexual en conflictos representa un fenómeno devastador con consecuencias perjudiciales para las víctimas, siendo las mujeres y niñas quienes están expuestas a una mayor precariedad frente a este flagelo usado como táctica de guerra, tortura y terrorismo en medio de crisis políticas y de seguridad que cada vez se tornan más graves y comunes, provocando desplazamiento, separación de familias y desaparición de seres queridos. Esta situación contraviene no solo las normas del derecho internacional humanitario, sino también menoscaba la dignidad humana. Exacerba significativamente y prolonga las situaciones de conflicto, destruye el tejido social e impide los esfuerzos de reconstrucción. Mi delegación ha condenado reiteradamente la violencia contra las mujeres y niños en situaciones de conflicto, incluida la violencia sexual, y realizado llamamientos dirigidos a todas las partes en los conflictos armados para que desistan de esos actos con efecto inmediato. Desafortunadamente, tales acciones continúan ocurriendo y algunas situaciones se han vuelto sistémicas y generalizadas, alcanzando un grado alarmante de brutalidad. Lamentablemente, el nivel de cumplimiento de las normas internacionales aplicables por las partes en conflicto, según lo expresado en el informe del secretario general, sigue siendo desalentador, a pesar que este Consejo ha realizado los esfuerzos necesarios para establecer marcos regulatorios sólidos. Prueba de ello es la devastadora agresión ilegal, no justificada y no provocada por parte de la Federación Rusa a Ucrania, que continúa aumentando la pérdida de vidas humanas, denegando el acceso humanitario e incrementando el riesgo de violencia sexual y trata de personas por los desplazamientos masivos internos. Son alarmantes los datos arrojados por las investigaciones realizadas por la Comisión Internacional Independiente de Investigación sobre Ucrania, siendo inconcebible que niñas menores de 4 años sean parte de estos graves crímenes. Encomiamos el trabajo realizado por la Oficina de la Representante Especial del Secretario General sobre Violencia Sexual en Conflictos para la creación del Grupo de Trabajo Interinstitucional para abordar el tema enfocado a la trata de personas, la prestación de asistencia a supervivientes, el acceso a justicia y las reparaciones. Instamos al Consejo a aplicar sanciones y promover el compromiso de abordar la violencia sexual en conflictos armados. Consideramos que las sanciones pueden usarse como una herramienta para prevenir y detener la violencia sexual en los conflictos armados y abordar la impunidad de los perpetradores. Señor presidente, para finalizar, consideramos que la nueva Agenda para la Paz debe incorporar acciones contundentes abordando las causas profundas del uso de la violencia sexual en conflictos, la prevención y las nuevas amenazas relacionadas identificadas por la representante especial, incluyendo el aspecto digital. Es responsabilidad de todos proteger a las poblaciones de este flagelo. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Guatemala for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Costa Rica.
Señor presidente, Costa Rica lamenta que la violencia sexual en los conflictos armados siga siendo la norma y que la justicia siga eludiendo a las víctimas y sobrevivientes desde Myanmar hasta Ucrania y desde Yemen hasta Haití. En este sentido, permítame destacar 3 aspectos. En primer lugar, la proliferación y circulación ilícita de armas pequeñas y ligeras y sus municiones contribuyen a facilitar y perpetuar la violencia sexual en situaciones de conflicto y posconflicto, exacerbando la vulnerabilidad de las personas. En consecuencia, el desarme y el control de armamentos constituyen un enfoque clave para prevenir y abordar estas atrocidades, como bien lo reconoce el marco de las Naciones Unidas para la prevención de la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos. Sin embargo, es necesario hacer más para articular los vínculos prácticos entre el desarme y el control de armamentos y la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad, en particular a nivel multilateral. Costa Rica llama a este Consejo a promover e incluir consideraciones de desarme y control de armas en sus discusiones y decisiones sobre mujer, paz y seguridad para avanzar aún más en la implementación de la agenda. A nivel práctico, Costa Rica pide una mayor armonización entre las estrategias nacionales de aplicación de la Agenda de Mujer, Paz y Seguridad y la regulación de armas pequeñas y ligeras mediante la integración de las prácticas de control de armas pequeñas y ligeras en los planes de acción nacionales sobre mujer, paz y seguridad y de las consideraciones de mujer, paz y seguridad en los planes de acción nacionales sobre las armas pequeñas y ligeras. Esto podría constituir un trampolín para impulsar estos esfuerzos a escala mundial. En segundo lugar, la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos no es una cuestión de mujeres, sino de seguridad, con implicaciones mucho más amplias. La violación no solo puede ser un precursor del conflicto, un diagnóstico de las condiciones previas a él y un síntoma de impunidad, sino también una prueba de la debilidad e insuficiencia del sector de seguridad. Un sector de seguridad robusto apoyará indudablemente la participación de las mujeres y mejorará los mecanismos de protección necesarios para eliminar la violencia sexual dentro y fuera de los conflictos. En tercer lugar, todas las resoluciones bajo la sombrilla de mujer, paz y seguridad se centran más en proteger el cuerpo de las mujeres que en liberar todo su potencial. Debemos hacer más para redefinir esta agenda, como lo es elaborar una nueva resolución independiente que replantee las prohibiciones a la educación como una nueva forma estructural de violencia contra las mujeres y las niñas. Señor presidente, es fundamental que los sobrevivientes sigan estando en el centro de nuestros esfuerzos. Debemos reconocer que los sobrevivientes tienen necesidades diferenciadas y pueden enfrentarse a múltiples e interrelacionadas formas de discriminación. Debemos garantizar que se protejan sus derechos, que se les trate con dignidad, que puedan acceder a la justicia y participar de forma segura, plena y significativa en la toma de decisiones en todos los niveles. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Costa Rica for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos a la representante especial del secretario general para la cuestión de violencia sexual en conflictos armados, Pramila Patten, por su presentación, especialmente por su apoyo a los esfuerzos de Colombia por prevenir y eliminar la violencia sexual en nuestro país. En Colombia, como en otras partes del mundo, esta forma de violencia afecta desproporcionalmente a mujeres y niñas, quienes representan el 92.6% del total de las víctimas y son en su inmensa mayoría afrodescendientes. Las personas de la comunidad LGTBIQ+, y con identidades de género y orientaciones sexuales diversas, también han sufrido distintos repertorios de violencia sexual que buscan imponer la heteronormatividad. Con miras a avanzar en la eliminación y la prevención de la violencia sexual, el gobierno de Gustavo Petro viene adelantando varias acciones. Primero, Colombia está en proceso de formular su primera política exterior feminista. Se trata de una política pacifista, participativa e interseccional que tiene en su centro la lucha contra las violencias basadas en género, dentro de las cuales resaltan las violencias sexuales que ocurren dentro y fuera del marco del conflicto armado. Segundo, tras 23 años de indecisión, Colombia está trabajando en su primer Plan de Acción Nacional sobre la Resolución 1325, proyecto que ha sido apoyado incansablemente por ONU Mujeres y por distintas organizaciones de la sociedad civil. Este proceso cuenta con 6 foros regionales, de los cuales ya se han realizado 4, y un gran foro nacional con mujeres de todo el país, así como foros territoriales y sectoriales con mujeres indígenas, LGBT, mujeres firmantes del proceso de paz, víctimas y mujeres de la diáspora. Tercero, el acuerdo de paz establece compromisos claros y medibles que buscan no solo integrar la perspectiva de género en la construcción de la paz, sino también abordar de manera integral las violencias contra las mujeres en todas sus formas, además de desarrollar estrategias específicas que buscan la recuperación emocional para las víctimas de violencia sexual y la rehabilitación psicosocial. En particular para las víctimas de violencia sexual, la Jurisdicción Especial de Paz tomó la decisión fundamental de abrir un macro caso para abordar específicamente la violencia sexual y basada en género durante el conflicto armado. Cuarto, nos hemos comprometido con los propósitos y las actividades de la Alianza Internacional sobre la Prevención de la Violencia Sexual en Conflicto, dentro de cuyo marco hemos puesto en marcha políticas de seguridad con enfoque preventivo y con espacios de capacitación para servidores públicos y la sociedad civil. Termino enfatizando que la garantía plena de la seguridad humana que atraviesa la política de paz total en Colombia se fundamenta en la premisa básica de que las víctimas y sobrevivientes tienen que estar en el centro de todos nuestros esfuerzos. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Colombia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns itself with the statements made on behalf of the EU and the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. We commend the United Kingdom for its efforts to organize the annual open debate on conflict-related sexual violence, and thank SRSG Pramila Patten for presenting the annual report of the Secretary General. Let me also thank the civil society briefers for sharing their perspectives. Over the past 15 years, the Security Council has established a robust framework of applicable international norms addressing CRSV, based on the condemnation of sexual violence as a tool of war and the recognition that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. However, both the annual report and today's briefers paint a dismal picture with regard to the compliance with these standards. Rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, forced marriage, and other abhorrent forms of sexual violence continue to be used in situations linked to conflict throughout the world, including as a systematic tactic of war. While women and girls are the primary targets, it is important to recognize that men, boys, and persons with diverse gender identities are also affected. Sexual and gender-based violence is unacceptable in any circumstance, and it is particularly despicable when used in a widespread targeted manner, which dramatically affects not only the immediate victims, but also their entire families, communities, as well as generations to come. Austria is appalled by the report's findings of persisting and even worsening patterns of sexual violence in many different contexts, including in DRC, Ethiopia, Haiti, and South Sudan. We deplore the use of sexual and gender-based violence against civilians and prisoners of war as a result of Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war on Ukraine, which has been documented extensively by the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine based in Vienna. Austria also remains deeply concerned about the situation in Afghanistan, where the Taliban de facto authorities have effectively erased women and girls from public life. We strongly condemn all forms of CRSV and join the Secretary General's call upon all parties to conflict to immediately cease such crimes, comply with relevant Security Council resolutions, and allow unhindered access to United Nations teams. In particular, we call upon the Russian Federation, all listed parties, and other perpetrators to make and implement specific time-bound commitments to combat sexual violence in line with their international obligations and the recommendations of the report. The most effective way to prevent CRSV is through strong compliance with the rule of law, which is also an indispensable precondition for sustainable peace and security. Therefore, we commend the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict for continuing to assist national authorities in over a dozen countries in strengthening rule of law institutions to enhance accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. Each state is responsible for ensuring accountability as well as access to justice for victims of CRSV. It is crucial to ensure that perpetrators are swiftly tried and held accountable. In this regard, we reiterate our full support to the International Criminal Court and to United Nations mandated commissions of inquiry. Moreover, we wish to remind member states of their obligation in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2467 to apply a survivor-centered approach and provide access to medical and psychosocial care. Mr. President, Austria applauds SRSG Pramila Patten for all her efforts to fulfill her mandate by working with member states and armed groups to comply with international law, international humanitarian law, human rights, and international norms. We also commend UN Women, whom we strongly support, including in Ukraine and Afghanistan, as well as UNFPA. We have also renewed our support to the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women and Girls this year. The immeasurable contributions of civil society organizations, in particular of women's and women-led organizations in preventing and responding to CRSV, also deserve to be emphasized. We stand in solidarity with all victims of CRSV and their families. Accordingly, we urge the members of the Security Council to take bolder actions, including the use of sanctions, in order to address CRSV and ultimately to stop blatant breaches of international law, resolve conflicts, and find solutions towards achieving sustainable peace and security. As a staunch supporter of Resolution 1325, adopted by this Council 23 years ago, and in view of the discussions on a new agenda for peace, Austria calls upon all Security Council members to collectively recommit to reinvigorating the Women, Peace and Security agenda and instilling new life into its implementation. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Austria for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Yes, Mr. President, Greece would like to thank warmly the United Kingdom for organizing today's timely event and the distinguished speakers for the thorough intervention, in particular the special representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and conflict, Mrs. Patten, for her presence. While fully aligning myself with the statements made by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, allow me to make some additional remarks under our national capacity. Despite systematic efforts by the UN system to strengthen the normative framework on conflict-related sexual violence, the latest report of the Secretary General clearly illustrates the gap between standards and commitments and the devastating reality on the ground. In many conflict environments, the parties to the conflict, state or non-state actors, continue to deploy the strategic use of CRSV against civilians, mostly women and girls, but also men and boys, as well as against members of the LGBTQI+ communities. The alarming frequency of CRSV and the prevailing impunity for those crimes, which is the norm rather than the exceptions, indicate rather low levels of compliance by states with the UN normative framework. Against this backdrop, there is undeniably an urgent need for holistic and coherent international policy action. In this vein, international response to CRSV should be inclusive and survival-centered, addressing the specific needs of different groups of survivors, focusing on the protection, relief and recovery, and therefore ensuring their full and meaningful participation in peace and transitional justice processes. At the same time, accountability of the perpetrators should be adequately addressed by facilitating the prosecution through appropriate judicial mechanisms and by ensuring unhindered judicial access and gender-responsive reparations for victims. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence is a horrific crime with devastating consequences for civilians, their families and the communities at large, a threat to security, and an impediment to the restoration of peace. In this regard, Greece supports a human-centered and gender-responsive approach to peace and security, which focuses primarily on the protection of civilians in conflict settings, especially women and children, girls and boys. This is reflected also in the priorities of the Greek candidacy for an elected member of the UN Security Council for 2025-2026, which include the promotion of the intellect agendas on A, the protection of civilians, B, women, peace and security, and C, children and armed conflict. In this vein, I would like to reiterate my country's determination to join hands with all like-minded stakeholders in order to accelerate prevention of and response to any form of CRSV, as the only way to build a peaceful, resilient, inclusive, and gender-equal societies. I thank you so much.
I thank the representative of Greece for their statements. Colleagues, we still have 40 speakers left to go, so I do encourage you to hit the 3-minute target, as our Greek colleague just did. So on that note, I give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you. Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation would like to express our appreciation to the United Kingdom for convening this important debate. Malaysia would also like to thank the briefers for their update and assessment. I'll try to be brief. Mr. President, Malaysia condemns the abhorrent use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism. We're gravely concerned with the reported heightened risk of sexual violence against civilians, particularly on women and children in conflict. The recent report by the UN Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence presents disturbing findings on patterns of sexual violence that persisted and further deepened in conflict situations. Against this background, we are dismayed by the prevalent impunity with perpetrators quite regularly absconding from accountability. Mr. President, efforts to address sexual violence in conflict situations should employ an integrated and holistic approach by all important stakeholders, including states, the whole UN system, and civil societies. It is critical for countries in conflict and post-conflict to take adequate and necessary measures to prevent and respond to CRSV. In this regard, my delegation wishes to highlight the following points. First, it is incumbent upon states to introduce or strengthen legislation and judicial processes to document, investigate, and prosecute sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations. Importantly, the state's duty to ensure accountability must be embedded in both domestic and international laws. All states have the obligation to prohibit CRSV and prosecute the perpetrators. We also call for provisions concerning CRSV to be integrated into the negotiations and agreements to the peace process. Second, we see merits in broadening networking and coordination between the Security Council and the Human Rights Council towards ensuring accountability for violations, including sexual assault and violence against women and children. Third, meaningful participation of women in prevention efforts, including peacekeeping and peace building, needs to be prioritized. Women's role as agents of change in the security framework can advance citizens' trust in the institutions and contribute towards improving intelligence gathering, reporting of gender-based violence, and treatment of victims, witnesses, and suspects. At the same time, we need to end the harassment and reprisal targeting women in peace and security process. Mr. President, Malaysia remains committed to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and the collective efforts to combat CRSV, including through the UN peacekeeping operations. Since 2014, the Malaysian Peacekeeping Center has continued to teach courses on gender as well as the role of women in peacekeeping missions. The elimination of conflict-related sexual violence is our collective moral duty. Let me conclude by stressing the importance for the Security Council to urgently work with relevant stakeholders and partners in our efforts to strengthen the protection of civilians, including women and children in conflict situations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, the delegation of Sierra Leone is pleased to join this global discourse on the theme sexual violence, promoting implementation of Security Council resolutions on conflict-related violence. I congratulate you for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of July 2023, and also thank you for convening this timely debate. Mr. President, having experienced one of the bloodiest and fiercest civil wars during which sexual violence, including rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, etc., were used as tactics of war by the warring factions, Sierra Leone is fully aware of the horrifying impact of these crimes on the lives and livelihoods of its women and girls, and it's sparing no effort at combating this scourge. Mr. President, there is no gainsaying that many commendable actions have been taken by both the General Assembly and the Council in the forms of treaties, conventions, and resolutions, including Resolution 1820 in 2008. Yet, women and children around the world remain vulnerable to sexual violence, be it in times of war or peace. There is still much to be done at the national, sub-regional, regional, and global levels if we are to fully implement landmark resolutions 1325, 1820, and other relevant human rights instruments in our grand effort to turn the tide against sexual violence in all its forms and manifestations. Mr. President, building on our domestic efforts, His Excellency President Bio, in his speech at the UN General Assembly in September 2021, called for global solidarity on access to justice, remedies, and assistance for survivors of sexual violence in the form of a stand-alone resolution, which was adopted by consensus by the General Assembly on the 2nd of September 2022. This resolution does not only highlight the gravity of sexual violence, but specifically calls out the crimes as abhorrent to international peace and security and will uplift survivors who deserve dignity and justice. I encourage all member states to implement the directives of the content of this resolution, as most of its elements speak to the issue of accountability and prevention. Peace, in our view, is not the absence of visible conflict, and that in order to have true peace, survivors must have access to justice. Mr. President, let me close by appealing to the delegations here present to deeply reflect upon the fact that, notwithstanding the many stringent measures adopted individually as well as collectively, the despicable crime of conflict-related violence, especially sexual violence, has continued unabated around the world, and many a time with total impunity. The time to accelerate effort is now, and there is the urgent need for concerted and concrete steps to be taken to address the incidences of sexual violence crimes, restore the dignity of survivors, such as promoting forwarding strategies and strengthening accountability as prevention through enforcing compliance with the relevant normative positions that we have all adopted. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you. Mr. President, we thank the UK for organizing today's debate. Slovenia aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union, the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect. We welcome the Secretary General's annual report and its presentation. Slovenia condemns in the most absolute terms the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war or as an instrument of repression and intimidation, and calls for the full implementation of the commitments to end it. Focusing on the prevention of sexual violence in situations directly or indirectly linked to a conflict, we would underline the following 3 points. First, impunity encourages the continued commission of these crimes, as evident by the fact that a sizable majority of the same perpetrators appear in these reports year after year. Support for and investment in strong justice systems and rule of law institutions are necessary to prosecute and punish the perpetrators and those responsible. To this end, Slovenia would also support the listing of sexual violence as a standalone criterion for targeted sanctions by the relevant sanctions committees. Second, we need to resolutely address barriers to reporting, monitoring, and documenting this crime. We see as vital in this regard humanitarian access, the accelerated deployment of women's protection advisors in all relevant situations of concern, in line with Security Council Resolution 2467. Provision of comprehensive and tailored support to survivors of sexual violence and children born of such violence, and close work with the affected communities to address the stigma, socioeconomic isolation, and fear of retaliation. Third, we need to encourage and facilitate the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in humanitarian, recovery, political, peace, security, and development processes. This is also essential to the availability and safeguarding of gender-based violence services. To conclude, Slovenia underlines its enduring support for the work and mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence. Slovenia will continue to work with partners such as UN Women, ICRC, UNFPA, and Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund to address the needs of survivors of sexual violence in conflict and support the work of human rights defenders and activists on this matter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the UK presidency for organizing this important debate and Special Representative Pramila Patten for her insightful briefing. I am especially grateful to briefers Ms. Hser and Ms. Nadine for sharing their testimonies and practical recommendations with us today. My delegation aligns itself with the statements by the European Union and on behalf of the group of friends of Women, Peace and Security, and we would also like to make a few points in our national capacity. The report presented reveals a distressing reality. Both state and non-state armed groups extensively employ conflict-related sexual violence, targeting civilians through rape, gang rape, and abductions. These findings yet again demonstrate that the Russian Federation persistently uses sexual violence as a weapon of war against Ukraine. Prosecutors and investigators have documented 212 cases of such crimes, including 13 cases involving children, 12 girls and 1 boy. These atrocities span across a wide age range, from the youngest victim at the tender age of 4 to the oldest survivor of 87. The UN has reported sexual violence as a form of torture and inhuman treatment against civilians and prisoners of war. It is crucial to recognize that these numbers only represent cases where survivors were able and willing to testify, suggesting that the actual figures are way much higher. Ukraine remains committed to replacing impunity with the justice and transforming indifference into action. The experiences, needs, and demands of survivors are at the heart of our efforts. We commend the efforts of Special Representative Patten and her team, who have provided substantial assistance to the government of Ukraine in achieving these goals. Last year, we signed a framework of cooperation with the UN to respond to and prevent CRSV, becoming the first country to establish an all-encompassing coordination mechanism for combating CRSV. Shortly after that, Ukraine adopted a detailed implementation plan involving state institutions, civil society, and international organizations. In partnership with UNFPA, we opened 11 survivors' relief centers across the country to provide victims with access to various services. To structure and ensure the effectiveness of this cooperation, we established the Interagency Working Group, focusing on 5 key areas: access to justice and accountability, comprehensive assistance to CRSV survivors, strengthening the security and defense sector to prevent CRSV, combating trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation, and reparations and compensations. Another crucial step is gaining political commitments and leading the international legal battle for justice. Ukraine joined the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative launched by the United Kingdom and proudly became a vice chair. We firmly believe that solid cooperation between governments, multilateral partners, civil society, and survivors is a crucial prerequisite for breaking the cycle of impunity. Our collective response must be resolute, unwavering, and decisive. There can be no tolerance for those responsible for inflicting mass suffering upon the most vulnerable and defenseless. All perpetrators must face the highest consequences for their crimes. In this regard, criminal accountability holds the utmost importance. However, above all, the international community must consolidate efforts to exert maximum pressure on Russia to end its brutal war of aggression, its war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. The truth is there, the evidence is there, and the punishment shall come. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the European Union, on behalf of the Group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect, as well as on behalf of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. Please allow me to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. The report, which was presented here today, provides an appalling picture of the global situation regarding conflict-related sexual violence. It describes a deep crisis of impunity and an unacceptable rule of lawlessness. Sexualized violence is deliberately being used as a tactic of war, as a means of torture, and of political repression by states and non-state parties, such as armed groups and mercenaries. It leaves societies traumatized for decades. It is a hindrance to reconciliation and goes unpunished too often. We have to ensure accountability by effectively prosecuting perpetrators. This is why we strongly support the mandate and work of SRSG Patten, her team of experts, and the UN Action to End CRSV. We support regularly inviting SRSG Patten to brief sanctions committees. We call on all states to join us in imposing restrictive measures against perpetrators of sexualized violence in conflict. Mr. President, how can we prevent CRSV from happening in the first place? Wars and armed attacks must be prevented at all costs. Furthermore, we have to level power imbalances that disadvantage women economically and politically, and we have to combat misogyny and gender stereotypes that enable gender-based violence. While the fight against structural root causes for CRSV is a long-term endeavor, I would like to point out essential measures that can protect and support survivors and victims in the short term. Recent reports suggest that there is a strong link between increased militarization and the proliferation of weapons on the one hand, and the occurrence of sexual violence in conflict on the other hand. Member states must therefore establish effective arms and ammunition control regimes. We also need to deploy more gender advisors in peace operations and special political missions. Moreover, member states need to provide accessible sexual and reproductive health services, as well as psychological and legal support and reparations. Last but not least, we have to match words with actions and provide predictable and reliable funding to combat CRSV. Germany strongly supports the mandate of SRSG Patten and the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. This year, we contributed with a project budget of €1 million for their important work. Since 2023, we've been the lead of the call to action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies, aiming at systematically improving prevention and mitigation of gender-based violence. We will continue to be strongly engaged. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank you for convening this critical debate today on this necessary yet disturbing topic. We thank the Special Representative, Ms. Pramila Patten, and other briefers from the field for their insights shared with us today. South Africa associates itself with the statement delivered by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence as an occurrence is shameful, but its continued use as a weapon of war is especially heinous. It is grave violation of international human rights law and international criminal law, and it is important that the international community takes a strong stance on this. It is distressing to note that the victims and survivors of such violence are often persons who already experience systemic discrimination or persecution. In particular, women and girls are targeted for rape, gang rape, and abductions, causing personal harm, social disruption, and prolonged socioeconomic consequences, which extend beyond the end of direct violence. The report of the Secretary General reminds us that people are often targeted on the basis of their sexual orientation and gender identity, and we will encourage greater recognition of this reality in the resolution of this august body. Mr. President, the report of the Secretary General highlights the strong linkage between instability or weakened governance and the increase in sexual violence. Poor rule of law and weakened state authority results in increased sexual violence as non-state actors conduct themselves without any concern or accountability. We must seek measures to act against such atrocity crimes and crimes against humanity. This should be done through prevention, protection, and the provision of support to victims and/or survivors. We thus recognize the value of women's protection advisors in the field and encourage the continued use of this endorsed service and priority. Unfortunately, we are disheartened by the limited resources allocated for such personnel and strongly advocate for an increased allocation, including through measures called for in Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2019. Mr. President, it is important to recognize that most state actors that are listed in the report have made formal commitments to adopt measures to address conflict-related sexual violence. So we must work together to support these state actors in their efforts. Yet it is non-state actors that are particularly prone to the use of sexual violence as a weapon, and the existence of such actors is directly connected to instability and weakened governance. We therefore continue to advocate for increased support to state actors and actions that address instability, including unconstitutional changes of government, which is also highlighted in the SG's report. In conclusion, South Africa remains committed in its efforts to address this terrible crime. Our work and focus must seek to prevent these crimes, support victims and survivors, and hold perpetrators accountable. We encourage the continued work on this issue by the Security Council and remain committed to support its ongoing efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and then, of course, my own country, Denmark. I want to begin by thanking first and foremost our distinguished briefers for their sobering statements, and not least, your vital work in this field. Colleagues, throughout 2022, sexual violence continued to be used as a tactic of war, as an instrument of intimidation, and as a way to dehumanize and destroy communities and the lives of civilians. In countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Haiti, Libya, Myanmar, and South Sudan. We are deeply alarmed by the reports of persisting and deepening patterns of sexual violence by both state and non-state actors. In Ukraine, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry have documented and reported sexual violence as a form of torture and inhumane treatment against civilians and prisoners of war. The violence is perpetrated overwhelmingly by Russian military personnel. Let us not mince words. Conflict-related sexual violence is a clear violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. And as the Secretary General has pointed out time and again, impunity for acts of conflict-related sexual violence remains the norm. This needs to be addressed. This needs to change. Conflict-related sexual violence can and must be prevented and countered. It is within the power and responsibility of member states to make that happen. It is the responsibility of this Council to act. To this end, the Nordic countries would like to emphasize the following. First, member states must investigate all cases, prosecute perpetrators through appropriate judicial mechanisms, and guarantee access to justice for victims and survivors. Second, our humanitarian response to conflict-related sexual violence must be gender transformative and put survivors' needs front and center. This could be through cash programming, sexual and reproductive health services such as access to emergency contraception and safe and timely abortion care, as well as mental health and psychosocial support. And third, all sanctions regimes must explicitly include sexual and gender-based violence as a designation criterion. Security Council Sanctions Committee should list perpetrators when there is repeated evidence of conflict-related sexual violence, including as put forward annually in the annex of the Secretary General's report. And lastly, the capacity and skills to act on conflict-related sexual violence and to refer different types of victims to appropriate service providers must be built across peace operations, not just among women peacekeepers. The notion that women are inherently better at or specifically responsible for responding to conflict-related sexual violence both perpetuates the idea that their primary added value is related to their gender and reflects a narrow understanding of the survivors and perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. Excellencies, protection is the bedrock for women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in political, social, and economic processes, which is in turn critical to ending conflict-related sexual violence and preventing its recurrence. We can therefore no longer watch survivors being sidelined from security policy. And we, the Nordics, will continue to work in collaboration with all partners, including security stakeholders and institutions, civil society, and women-led and feminist organizations, not least at the local level, to push back on any attempt to hinder the full, equal, and meaningful participation of all women. Let me conclude by underlining that the Nordics continue to stand firm on zero tolerance for any reprisals against women human rights defenders and fully support their advocacy for gender equality and defending human rights. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Italy.
I would like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this annual open debate, as well as the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, and the distinguished representatives of the civil society for their briefings. Italy aligns itself with the statements of the European Union, of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the Group of Friends of Responsibility to Protect, and would like to add the following remarks in its national capacity. Mr. Chair, this year we celebrate the 15th anniversary of the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1820 that has established conflict-related sexual violence as a self-standing security issue. Since then, the UN have built up a more robust normative framework to address this issue, in particular by establishing the mandate of the Special Representative. We reiterate our strong support for the mandate and the work of the Office of the SRSG Patten and the team of experts. Yet, we face a disturbing reality where conflicts increase by frequency, scope, and intensity. Sexual violence, slavery, and exploitation proliferate also in the context of internal and cross-border displacement, protracted displacement, abduction, and trafficking. The respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law is being challenged to an unprecedented extent. We express our deep concern for the blurring of distinction of the responsibilities between state and non-state actors, highlighted in the SG report, which complicates the attribution for the heinous crimes and undermines accountability. We condemned the use of sexual violence as deliberated warfare tactic, and we joined the call of the members of the Group of Friends of WPS to urge the Security Council to use all tools at its disposal to support effective action against conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence as a weapon of war. We also recognize the important role of the International Criminal Court in investigating and prosecuting sexual violence within the context of armed conflicts in accordance with its mandate under the Rome Statute and relevant Security Council resolution. Mr. Chair, as the Secretary General writes in his report, harnessing the preventing power of the rule of law is essential, and this is indeed the time for action. All the risk factors that contribute to make sexual violence in conflict a largely underreported crime must be addressed in a comprehensive way if we want to actually break the circle of impunity. On the one hand, we must act on prevention to disrupt the gender inequality entrenched in harmful social norms and practices. On the other, we must act on response to remove the multiple barriers that hinder access to services, to reporting, and to formal justice. We must invest in programs and policies aimed at ensuring that assistance is accessible and safe for victims and survivors, free from fear of social stigma, intimidation, and reprisal. We must invest in gender-responsive security and justice sector reforms. We must ensure that these same principles be embedded in the training of military personnel deployed at national level, as well as in the UN peacekeeping and special political missions. Mr. Chair, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda provides a crucial framework for the collective action of the Council. We commend the work of women's civil society organizations, who are often at the front line of war and conflicts, providing relief and protection, and contributing to build and consolidate community resilience. We reiterate the importance of supporting safe spaces for effective women participation in the framework of a credible and sustainable national action plans on WPS. We call on the international community to reaffirm in this context the commitment to address the root causes of conflict and the structural gender inequalities and barriers hindering the full enjoyment of rights by all women and girls in all spheres of public and political life. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Chile agradece al Reino Unido por convocar este debate abierto. Tomamos nota de las ponencias y las contribuciones escuchadas. Chile suscribe a la vez la intervención del Grupo de Amigos de la Responsabilidad de Proteger y del Grupo de Amigos de Mujer, Paz y Seguridad. Señor presidente, Chile condena la violencia sexual en los conflictos armados. Este tipo de violencia sexual y de género es utilizada como una táctica de guerra en forma sistemática y reiterada y representa una grave violación a los derechos humanos y constituye un crimen de guerra. Con razón, este Consejo de Seguridad ha reconocido que la violencia sexual puede exacerbar y prolongar significativamente las situaciones de conflicto armado y obstaculizar el restablecimiento de la paz. No se pueden banalizar estas conductas ni asumir como un costo colateral de la guerra o de situaciones de crisis internas. Señor presidente, por esto y muchas razones creemos que es indispensable en la formación de las Fuerzas Armadas que se integre o profundice la perspectiva de género de forma permanente, incluyendo medidas para prevenir la violencia sexual y a los contingentes que participan en misiones de paz. En línea con esto, Chile apoya la iniciativa Acción para el Mantenimiento de la Paz del Secretario General, exigiendo una conducta adecuada a todo el personal de la organización en misiones, apoyando la política de tolerancia cero de las Naciones Unidas con un enfoque centrado en las víctimas respecto de todas las formas de explotación y abusos sexuales. Chile ve con preocupación que aún existen muchas situaciones de violencia sexual en conflictos armados que no han sido objeto de investigación o enjuiciamiento, lo que podría tener un efecto disuasivo y de prevención, por lo que corresponde a la comunidad internacional reaccionar apoyando a los países a reforzar sus instituciones de justicia, siempre teniendo en vista la posibilidad de recurrir a tribunales internacionales como la Corte Penal Internacional cuando corresponda. Por eso Chile reitera su compromiso con los instrumentos internacionales que sancionan los actos de violencia sexual como crímenes de guerra, como el Estatuto de la Corte Penal Internacional y las Convenciones de Ginebra sobre Derecho Humanitario. Del mismo modo, el cumplimiento de las resoluciones de este Consejo es imperativo para poner fin a la utilización de la violencia sexual como arma de guerra. La resolución 1820 de 2008 fue un importante paso para reconocer esta violencia, y las resoluciones posteriores que demuestran que el tema es una preocupación permanente de este Consejo. También la resolución 1960 del 2010, que establece un sistema de rendición de cuentas para acabar con la violencia sexual asociada a situaciones de conflicto, lo que se ha agudizado en los últimos años. En este mismo sentido, Chile apoya la designación de sanciones selectivas aplicadas por los comités respectivos del Consejo de Seguridad en contra de quienes estén involucrados en la comisión de crímenes de violencia sexual, ya sea como perpetradores o como ideólogos. Es importante, asimismo, proporcionar asistencia multidisciplinaria, oportuna, no discriminatoria, que permita a las víctimas reintegrarse en plenitud a sus comunidades y contribuir a la consolidación de la paz. Ello es fundamental para promover, proteger y garantizar el acceso de las víctimas de violencia sexual a servicios de salud adecuados que permitan la rehabilitación de las supervivientes. Finalmente, debe existir un compromiso de toda la comunidad internacional para apoyar los esfuerzos de los países en el posconflicto, para incorporar como tema específico en la justicia transicional la cuestión de la violencia sexual en conflictos armados, promoviendo mecanismos jurídicos para acoger denuncias y llevar adelante las investigaciones penales. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Chile for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Uruguay.
Señor presidente, en primer lugar deseo agradecer al Reino Unido en la presidencia del Consejo en el corriente mes de julio por haber convocado a este debate abierto sobre un tema de particular relevancia como la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos, vinculándolo en esta oportunidad a la promoción de las resoluciones del Consejo de Seguridad sobre el particular. También agradezco la presencia de la señora Pramila Patten, que se expresó esta mañana, representante especial del Secretario General sobre la violencia sexual en los conflictos armados, así como de los representantes de organizaciones y de la sociedad civil que se expresaron sobre el tema en la sesión de esta mañana. La violencia sexual en conflictos armados es brutal, deliberada y tiene la intención de castigar y o humillar a las personas y sus comunidades, muchas veces motivada por objetivos políticos, militares, económicos, para controlar el territorio o los recursos. A menudo se perpetra en el contexto de abusos contra poblaciones civiles que probablemente sean objetivo debido a su pertenencia percibida o real a un grupo étnico, minoría religiosa, grupo político o por su identidad de género u orientación sexual real o percibida. El Estatuto de la Corte Penal Internacional incluye la violación y algunos otros tipos de violencia sexual en la lista de crímenes de guerra y en la lista de actos que constituyen crímenes de lesa humanidad cuando se cometen como parte de un ataque generalizado o sistemático contra la población civil. La resolución 1820, adoptada por el Consejo de Seguridad por consenso de sus 15 miembros, reconoce que la violencia sexual puede constituir crímenes internacionales, como crímenes de lesa humanidad, tortura o ser un acto constitutivo de genocidio. Este Consejo ha seguido reiterando su preocupación por la continuidad de los actos de violencia contra mujeres y niños en situaciones de conflicto a través de diversas resoluciones, entre ellas la 2467 de 2019. A pesar de la existencia de un amplio marco jurídico normativo sobre la violencia sexual y de género, el reporte presentado por el Secretario General sobre violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos continúa dando cuenta de variadas situaciones, entre otras en los casos de Afganistán, República Centroafricana, Colombia, República Democrática del Congo, Irak, Libia, Mali, Myanmar, Somalia, Sudán, Sudán del Sur, Siria, Ucrania y Yemen. En sus recomendaciones al Consejo de Seguridad, el Secretario General pide que se exhorte a todas las partes en los conflictos poner fin a todas las formas de violencia sexual relacionada con los mismos. Señor presidente, Uruguay entiende que esta recomendación es fundamental, pero también insuficiente si no se siguen, en particular, las recomendaciones del informe del Secretario General en el párrafo 75, en el literal G sobre alerta temprana y H relativo a las consultas en el terreno, en especial con organizaciones lideradas por mujeres. En este contexto, en primer lugar, es esencial dar garantías que la violencia sexual es objeto de un seguimiento sistemático y que se incorpora como criterio de designación independiente para la imposición de sanciones selectivas con el fin de disuadir a todas las partes, incluidos los mercenarios y las empresas militares y de seguridad privadas, de cometer este tipo de violencia. Entendemos que la acuciante gravedad de esta temática debe tratarse con los incentivos pertinentes para combatirla. En segundo lugar, hacemos eco de la recomendación de considerar la posibilidad de que el Consejo remita a la Fiscalía de la Corte Penal Internacional las situaciones en las que parezcan haberse cometido crímenes de violencia sexual, tal como está definido en su estatuto. La certeza de que deberán rendirse cuentas sobre estos crímenes, como mencioné anteriormente, brutales y deliberados, debe estar cada vez más presente si lo que se busca es su combate de manera certera. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Uruguay for their statements. Colleagues, I remind you to try to stick to the 3-minute limit. We still have 30 speakers to go. Now, I give the floor to the representative of Botswana.
Mr. President, I have the honor of delivering this statement
on behalf of the group of friends of the responsibility to protect, consisting of 55 member states and the European Union, and this year co-chaired by Botswana, Costa Rica, and Croatia. The group would like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing today's important open debate and the briefers for their insightful remarks. This year marks the 15th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1820. Despite the progress made to implement this important resolution, sexual violence remains pervasive in conflicts today, impacting thousands of persons every year, in particular women and children. The 2022 Secretary General's annual report identifies 17 countries in which CRSV is being perpetrated. We can only assume this is the tip of the iceberg, as sexual violence remains severely underreported. It is therefore urgent that we devise strategies to collectively address and prevent CRSV and uphold on our responsibility to protect. And we must reject the perception that sexual and gender-based violence is an inevitable product of war. Mr. President, as it is primary responsibility of member states to protect their populations against atrocity crimes, including where those atrocities involve rape and other forms of sexual violence, the group of friends of the responsibility to protect would like to stress the following points. Firstly, strengthening the capacity of national institutions is critical to ensuring accountability and to preventing and deterring such crimes in the future. The connection between conflict-related sexual violence and gender-based violence and discrimination against women and girls in times of peace is very clear. In this regard, it is of utmost importance that the states put in place and enforce legislative and institutional processes to comprehensively address all forms of sexual violence and gender-based violence, including sexual in peacetime as well as during conflict. Ensuring states are aware of their obligations and responsibilities to address conflict-related violence under international law is essential if we are to close the implementation gap. Secondly, where national institutions are not able or willing to take action against perpetrators of sexual violence, the international community should act to ensure accountability for such crimes. For example, the UN Security Council has shown that it can use targeted sanctions against those who perpetrate and direct sexual violence in armed conflict, and we encourage it to take further such action. Thirdly, there is an urgent need for a survivor-centered, trauma-informed approaches to support the needs of victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence during and after situations of conflict, including the needs of the children born from sexual violence in conflict. Lastly, Mr. President, at the heart of sexual and gender-based violence lies a disregard for human rights, as well as a perpetuation of systematic gender inequality, asymmetric power structures, and pervasive discrimination. Sexual violence in conflict must be addressed with full, equal, and meaningful leadership of women, including women's rights and civil society organizations, in the establishment of prevention mechanism. This also requires the inclusion of survivors and affected communities in identifying holistic solutions that address their needs. It is equally important to continue to engage men and community leaders to play a positive role in combating sexual violence and addressing gender stereotypes and the exclusion of women and girls. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Botswana for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, deseo expresar mis palabras expresando el profundo agradecimiento de mi país al Reino Unido por haber convocado este importante debate. Quiero también reconocer el liderazgo y el destacado trabajo de la señora Pramila Patten y de su oficina, así como expresar mi gratitud a las demás panelistas por sus valiosas contribuciones. Gracias por arrojar luz sobre las crudas realidades de violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos. Señor presidente, con 2.455 casos verificados por Naciones Unidas y muchos otros que quedan en la oscuridad, queda claro que la violencia sexual sigue siendo un flagelo perverso y devastador en los conflictos. 94% de estas víctimas son mujeres y niñas, donde la vasta mayoría son niñas. Es un doloroso panorama que se ha agravado en varios escenarios de conflictos, utilizándose como una táctica de terror, tortura, intimidación y represión política, y una herramienta despiadada de desplazamiento forzado y deshumanización de personas inocentes y vulnerables. Las consecuencias de esta violencia son profundas y duraderas para las víctimas, quienes sufren no solo física y psicológicamente, sino también socialmente. A menudo se ven estigmatizadas y aisladas, arrastrando consigo un trauma profundo y desgarrador. Frente a esta urgente situación, es imperativo que abordemos la violencia sexual relacionada con conflictos con una determinación inquebrantable y una acción colectiva. Se necesita adoptar enfoques integrales que abarquen la prevención, la protección, la justicia, el apoyo a las sobrevivientes y establecer marcos legales que criminalicen estos actos y que garanticen la rendición de cuentas de los perpetradores. La rendición de cuentas debe ser el pilar fundamental en nuestro combate contra la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos y así poner fin a la impunidad. Al mismo tiempo, es fundamental enfocarnos en las necesidades y los derechos de las mujeres y las niñas y preservar incansablemente en la lucha por la igualdad de género y el pleno respeto y disfrute de sus derechos humanos. El derecho internacional establece las obligaciones de los Estados y las partes en conflicto para prevenir, investigar y sancionar estos actos atroces. Y en ese sentido es de vital importancia que se implementen plenamente las resoluciones de este Consejo que abordan esta problemática a fin de garantizar la rendición de cuentas y brindar justicia a las víctimas. Permítame enfatizar, señor presidente, en la preocupante situación en Haití. El informe del secretario general confirma los niveles alarmantes que ha alcanzado la violencia sexual relacionada con el conflicto en ese país. Bandas criminales han utilizado esa violencia como arma de guerra para castigar y aterrorizar a comunidades enteras. La adopción de la resolución 2653, que crea un comité de sanciones y un panel de expertos, ha sido paso importante para monitorear y abordar esta lamentable situación, y esperamos que el próximo informe del secretario general nos arroje datos más alentadores tras esfuerzos realizados por las autoridades haitianas y el compromiso de las partes en cumplir sus obligaciones. Debo destacar que la resolución del mandato de la BINU, mediante la resolución 2692 de este Consejo, en el día de hoy, ha sido otro paso importante. En dicha resolución se establece que la Unidad de Derechos Humanos de esta oficina contará con capacidades específicas para abordar la violencia sexual y de género, incluyendo la identificación de asesoras para la protección de las mujeres. La situación en Haití nos recuerda también cuán crucial es trabajar hacia la eliminación del tráfico ilícito de armas y municiones en la lucha contra la violencia contra la mujer y las niñas. Señor presidente, es fundamental empoderar a las comunidades locales e involucrar a hombres y niños como aliados en esta lucha para lograr un cambio inclusivo y sostenible. Acabar con este horrendo crimen es cosa de todos, incluyendo nuestra responsabilidad colectiva de restaurar la dignidad de todas las víctimas y sobrevivientes. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic, and I give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie le Royaume-Uni d'avoir organisé ce débat public dans le cadre de sa présidence. Nos remerciements vont aussi à la représentante spéciale Pramila Patten et son équipe, ainsi qu'aux deux représentantes de la société civile pour leurs recommandations. Le Luxembourg souscrit pleinement à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et à celle des groupes des amis sur les femmes et la paix et la sécurité et sur la responsabilité de protéger. Permettez-moi de les compléter par quelques considérations à titre national. Les droits humains fondamentaux des survivantes, tels que les droits à la dignité, à la vie privée, à la santé, à la sécurité, à l'accès à la justice, à la vérité et à un recours effectif, sont au centre de la politique étrangère féministe du Luxembourg. Dans ce contexte, mon pays vient de souscrire au Code Mourad et de rejoindre la nouvelle Alliance pour la prévention de la violence sexuelle en situation de conflit. Nous sommes reconnaissants au Royaume-Uni d'avoir lancé ces initiatives et nous encourageons tous les États membres à s'y joindre. Le Luxembourg continue également de soutenir l'initiative Stand, Speak, Rise Up, le FNUAP, ONU Femmes et Justice Rapid Response, ainsi que le mandat de la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général chargé de la question des violences sexuelles commises en période de conflit. Monsieur le Président, malgré les nombreuses résolutions adoptées par le Conseil de sécurité depuis 2008, les violences sexuelles persistent et continuent d'être utilisées comme armes de guerre au Mali, au Myanmar, en RDC, au Soudan du Sud, en Syrie et dans d'autres conflits. Comme le souligne le secrétaire général dans son rapport, les acteurs impliqués se multiplient. En Ukraine, le Haut-Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme a documenté 109 cas de violences sexuelles perpétrés par les militaires russes. L'âge des victimes variait de 4 à 82 ans. Là aussi, on peut parler de l'utilisation de la violence sexuelle comme arme de guerre. Afin de mettre fin au cycle de violences sexuelles, le Luxembourg souhaite faire 4 recommandations. Premièrement, la lutte contre l'impunité doit être au centre de nos efforts. Et un rôle clé revient ici à la Cour pénale internationale. Les violences sexuelles en temps de conflit sont des crimes de guerre et peuvent être constitutives de crimes contre l'humanité ou du crime de génocide. Nous soutenons les travaux en cours concernant une convention sur les crimes contre l'humanité. Deuxièmement, par le biais de mécanismes d'enquête, nous devons appuyer le travail de documentation des crimes commis. Troisièmement, une coopération étroite avec la société civile doit être assurée et nous devons protéger ces partenaires clés contre les représailles en prenant les mesures appropriées. Quatrièmement et enfin, nous devons nous attaquer aux causes profondes des violences sexuelles et redoubler les efforts de prévention. Il s'agit non seulement de mettre fin à la culture d'impunité, mais aussi de reconnaître que la violence sexuelle est liée à l'inégalité des genres. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Luxembourg for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mr. President, Belgium subscribes to the statements by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. We'd like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate, Special Representative Patten for her remarks, and we explicitly thank the civil society briefers for their powerful and insightful contributions. Participation by civil society allows us to take into consideration the experience of those impacted. Everything we say and do should fully take into account the needs and perspectives of the survivors of these abhorrent crimes. By doing so, it is clear that access to justice, as well as sexual and reproductive health, rights and services, should be an integral part of UN and national responses to CRSV. For survivors of CRSV, this means inter alia access to treatment for internal physical injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, emergency contraception, safe abortion, and pre- and postnatal care. Monsieur le Président, les présentations d'aujourd'hui et le rapport du secrétaire général sont tout à fait déconcertants, notamment en ce qui concerne les niveaux extrêmement bas de conformité, y compris de la part des États. Il est urgent de combler cette lacune. Qui dit mise en œuvre dit aussi application et lutte contre l'impunité. Mon gouvernement soutient cet effort, entre autres en finançant l'équipe d'experts sur l'état de droit et la violence sexuelle dans les conflits, qui coopère avec les autorités de l'Ukraine et de la République démocratique du Congo, parmi d'autres. Nous saluons leur engagement, les encourageons, ainsi que d'autres, à poursuivre dans cette voie et demandons aux autres États d'envisager de soutenir l'équipe d'experts. Moreover, while acknowledging that preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence is the primary responsibility of states, Belgium stresses the need to explore how CRSV can be connected to sanctions policy and practices. For instance, by considering a more systematic input of information from the Office of the Special Representative of the Sanction Committees of this Council. Mr. President, finally, we should recognize that conflict-related sexual violence is rooted in structural gender inequality and harmful social norms. Belgium couldn't agree more with the Secretary General's recommendations to tackle the root causes of CRSV by promoting women's and girls' leadership, by creating an enabling environment for women and girls active in public life, and by stepping up to protect women politicians from violence and reprisals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Belgium for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Mr. President, on behalf of the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and my own country, Latvia, I extend my gratitude to the United Kingdom for organizing this open debate and to the distinguished briefers for their presentations. Mr. President, as we reflect upon the previous year, we see that sexual violence persisted as a cruel weapon of war, torture, and terrorism in various regions, including in Myanmar, Syria, Libya, and Iran, where it was employed to intimidate and punish political opponents. Displaced women and girls in Mozambique, the DRC, Somalia, and Sudan fell victim to sexual assault by armed individuals in and around displacement sites. The Baltic states commend the UN's tireless efforts in addressing these horrific situations. We appreciate the work of the UN Interagency Network, Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, for the initiatives providing crucial support to survivors, including medical, psychological, legal, and socio-economic assistance. A notable example in this project implemented in the conflict-free mining sites in the DRC. We also express our appreciation to the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict for their contributions in strengthening the rule of law institutions. Their efforts, including assisting Ghanaian authorities in establishing an ad hoc tribunal, deserve recognition. Mr. President, unfortunately, conflict-related sexual violence is also part of the full-scale war of aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Since February 24 of last year, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine documented 125 cases of conflict-related sexual violence affecting civilians and prisoners of war, while the real number is even higher. These heinous acts committed by the Russian armed forces and groups as a tactic of war, including torture methods such as electrocution, beatings, burns, forced nudity, and rape, including gang rape. The victims ranged from young children to the elderly, with perpetrators even raping women and girls in front of their family members. Moreover, Russia's attacks on hospitals hindered access to services for managing the aftermath of the sexual violence. It is horrendous that the permanent member of this esteemed council is responsible for these crimes and continues to commit atrocities on a daily basis. Furthermore, the Russian Federation seeks to stifle the United Nations voice and action through its veto powers. Yet the international community refuses to be silenced. The General Assembly recognized the need to hold the Russian Federation accountable and to establish an international mechanism for reparations. This May, the Register of Damage under the Council of Europe was established, signifying steps towards justice for Ukraine. We look forward to the Ministers of Justice meeting of the Council of Europe in Riga, Latvia in September to continue implementing the Register of Damage. In conclusion, we express our appreciation for the Special Representative's tireless work. We assure of our unwavering support for her and for anyone dedicated to preventing sexual violence, assisting survivors, and assuring accountability for the perpetrators both in Ukraine and elsewhere. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's open debate. And I also thank the briefers, SRSG Patten, and the representative of civil society for sharing the realities of sexual violence and conflicts. My delegation aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and also the statements delivered on behalf of the group of friends on women, peace and security and responsibility to protect. Allow me to share some national perspectives. 75 years since the establishment of the United Nations, the adoptions of its charter, and of the Universal Human Rights Declaration, one thing remains clear. A world without human rights is a world without peace. This year's Secretary General's report identified 17 countries in which CRSV is deployed as a strategy in conflict by terrorist and non-state armed groups, but also by state authorities. Unfortunately, in almost all settings covered in the report, impunity persists, undermining peace processes and reconstruction efforts. Our national pledge to implement the provisions of the UN Security Council's resolution on combating abuse and sexual exploitation in conflict are mostly visible in two areas. On the one hand, we have invested in training our armed forces, including those participating in peacekeeping activities, on the prohibition of all forms of sexual violence against civilians. On the other hand, the active presence of Romania as co-chair of the WPS Focal Point Network reconfirms our commitment for advancing the global women, peace and security agenda that also includes CRSV. We will make sure that this topic will be diligently addressed at the ministerial meeting of the WPS Focal Points later this September. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report raises awareness on the increased risks of trafficking for the purposes of sexual exploitation in Ukraine's vicinity following the large-scale displacements triggered by the war of aggression started by Russia. Allow me to assure you that the Romanian authorities, along with partners from civil society and the private sector, work tirelessly to circumvent this phenomenon. Among the measures put in place by Romania to prevent the risks associated with human trafficking for refugees from Ukraine, I would like to mention a mechanism for early identification of victims, the setup of a national emergency fund for victims, a dedicated working group for preventing sexual exploitation, and the funding of NGOs for delivering survivor-centered support, including access to psychosocial, healthcare, and legal services. We invested all these efforts because we consider that ending the climate of impunity is the way forward to prevent a response to CRSV. Likewise, we believe that accountability measures should be adopted and implemented at national level, and international accountability mechanisms should be in place. The stories of survivors of sexual violence, mostly women and girls, like the ones we heard this morning, need to be told, but most importantly, needs to be heard so that action can follow. As government representatives, we need to create the conditions so that conflict-related sexual violence does not remain underreported or be one of the least condemned crimes. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Romania for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Muchas gracias. España se suma a la intervención de la Unión Europea y del Grupo de Amigos Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad del que formamos parte. El Consejo de Seguridad ha reconocido que la mejor manera de proteger a los civiles frente a la violencia sexual en conflicto, y en particular a las mujeres y niñas, es la prevención y la disuasión de repetición, de manera que la violencia sexual deje de utilizarse como arma de guerra. Además, ha establecido medidas sancionadoras dirigidas a los perpetradores y reparadoras para las supervivientes, que deberían suponer una garantía para prevenir la impunidad. Sin embargo, nos encontramos con que la impunidad es la regla general y habitual cuando se aborda la rendición de cuentas. La impunidad prevalece cuando casos contra los perpetradores no prosperan en primera instancia o cuando se recurre a soluciones extrajudiciales alejadas de las normas internacionales de justicia y reparación de las víctimas. España entiende que la mejor manera de fortalecer la prevención de la violencia sexual en conflicto es trabajando a favor de la igualdad de género, la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos y la participación plena, significativa y eficaz de las mujeres en sus sociedades. Además, la prevención funciona mejor cuando son las propias mujeres y sus organizaciones quienes participan en su desarrollo, puesta en práctica y supervisión, así como cuando se les dota de los recursos necesarios para realizar dicha labor. Por eso, debemos comprometernos con una financiación previsible y sostenida destinada al Fondo Fiduciario Multipartito. Otra forma eficaz de poner en práctica la lucha contra la impunidad es la de enviar urgentemente personal experto en materia de violencia sexual en conflictos y de género para investigar los casos y crear entornos seguros en los países de tránsito y destinos de las víctimas. La generación de evidencias es fundamental para seguir trabajando en este ámbito. Del mismo modo, es fundamental que las operaciones de paz perfeccionen y amplíen los mandatos de protección. Es importante que la respuesta a esta violencia se centre en las y los supervivientes y en las víctimas, en un enfoque integral que incluya acceso a los servicios de salud, incluida la salud sexual y reproductiva, mental y psicosocial, el apoyo jurídico y los proyectos de medio de vida o de generación de ingresos. En este sentido, nos congratulamos de que la acción de Naciones Unidas contra la violencia sexual en conflicto utilice dicho enfoque. Señor presidente, el tercer Plan de Acción Nacional de Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad de España prestará especial atención a las mujeres en Ucrania. Incluirá medidas para garantizar la investigación sobre el uso de la violencia sexual como arma de guerra y la protección de las víctimas, así como la participación significativa de las mujeres en la consolidación de la paz y la reconstrucción de Ucrania. España organiza, junto con los Países Bajos, el curso sobre enfoque integral de género en operaciones, que se imparte 4 veces al año y tiene como uno de sus objetivos equipar tanto al personal militar como al civil con medios prácticos para interactuar con las mujeres y los hombres locales. Adicionalmente, España organizará en los próximos meses una serie de reuniones sobre la lucha contra la violencia sexual en conflicto en el marco de nuestra presidencia del Consejo de la Unión Europea. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Spain for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Portugal aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, and categorically condemns the use of sexual and gender-based violence by state and non-state actors in situations of humanitarian crisis and conflict-affected settings. We welcome the convening of this debate, which is particularly significant in the light of the concerning trends emphasized by the Secretary-General's report. The widespread pattern of sexual violence it depicts shows how pressing is the work and mandate of Special Representative Pramila Patten, whose briefing I thank. One of the alarming trends highlighted in the report is the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war by non-state armed groups to consolidate control over territories or exploit lucrative natural resources in certain countries. Furthermore, the increasing proliferation of mercenary groups has also led to a rise in violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law. Conflict-related sexual violence continues to cause massive displacements, both internally and across borders. The refugee crisis stemming from the war in Ukraine has led to a rampant risk of women trafficking for sexual exploitation. In this regard, we welcome the establishing of a comprehensive interagency working group to address sexual violence, which focus on anti-trafficking measures. As armed conflicts escalate and their devastating consequences unfold, disproportionately affecting women and children, we cannot remain idle. These abhorrent crimes must be punished and the perpetrators brought to justice. The Security Council has already adopted a comprehensive framework to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence. We call on all states to ensure its implementation in national legislation and make clear efforts to combat sexual and gender-based violence, safeguard women's rights during times of conflict, provide redress for survivors, and ensure accountability for perpetrators. But combating conflict-related sexual violence is also a shared responsibility that rests with all of us gathered here today. The Security Council can make significant advances by designating conflict-related sexual violence as a criterion in all relevant UN-sanctioned regimes. The UN and Member States can also bolster accountability efforts and increase compliance with international legal framework by assisting other Member States to harmonise domestic laws with international standards, providing support to justice systems, both military and civilian. In order for this to happen, states must cooperate in these efforts in every level, embracing a genuine desire to promote equality in the realisation of civil, cultural, economic, political and social rights between women and men, dismantling discriminatory social norms and gender stereotypes, and work on prevention. This is the only way to ensure the end of sexual and gender-based violence in any setting, while also fostering sustainable peace and political and social stability, which should be the main driver of all of our actions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Portugal for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statements made by the European Union, the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the Group of Friends on R2P. And let me thank you and the UK for organizing today's debate and for keeping conflict-related sexual violence on the agenda of the Council. And we also like to thank SRSG Patten for her briefing this morning and reiterate our full support for her mandate. We are very grateful for the important work that the SRSG and her staff are doing despite difficult circumstances. Allow me to also extend my special gratitude to today's civil society's briefers. We'd like to thank you for your courage to break the cycle of silence and stigma around CRSV. And your experience and contributions, as well as those of other CSOs and survivors, should guide our efforts to prevent and address CRSV. As we heard from the presentations and the debate today, levels of sexual violence are increasing. Horrific reports, including from Sudan and Ukraine, have illustrated its severe and lasting impact on individuals, communities and societies. And sadly, the statistics in the report on CRSV are only the tip of the iceberg. We urgently need more and better data in order to fully capture the scale of this problem and to better tailor our responses. So urgent and joined-up efforts are needed to improve the availability and harmonization of data across the system, while of course ensuring safety and confidentiality. I would briefly like to mention 3 areas for action today. First, we need to eliminate harmful social norms and gender stereotypes that perpetuate or justify conflict-related sexual violence and address its root causes. This is something that cannot be done overnight, but good practices already exist. For example, in South Sudan, the Netherlands supports a project that promotes discussions on positive masculinity and works with religious and local leaders to adequately address gender-based violence. And we should look at sharing and scaling up those best practices. Second, as also mentioned by Ms. Na this morning, we need to protect those in the most vulnerable positions, including women human rights defenders. 2023 marks 25 years since the adoption of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, so it should feel a special responsibility to support these courageous women and be clear that any form of violence or intimidation or any attempt to limit their space to speak up is unacceptable. And finally, it's important to adopt a holistic approach to national and international accountability. Justice should not be seen as limited to criminal proceedings. We should respect the choices of victims and survivors when it comes to their path to healing, recovering and finding justice, and make sure that their choices inform our policies and programs. And a final point on accountability. When states are unwilling or unable to act, thematic sanctions can serve as a last resort, as shown by the initiative by the Netherlands in collaboration with Germany and France for EU sanctions for acts of violence against women. Mr. President, with our feminist foreign policy, the Kingdom of the Netherlands stands firmly for the right to a dignified life free from violence for all. We are committed to work with all stakeholders for concrete action and progress to take preventative action and to better the lives of those affected by CRSV. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Netherlands for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, my delegation would like to express its appreciation to the UK for convening today's open debate on this important matter. We would also like to convey our gratitude to all the briefers, including SRSG on sexual violence in conflict, Pramila Patten, and extend a warm welcome to this year's report by the Secretary General. The Republic of Korea aligns itself with the statement delivered by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends of WPS, as well as the statement delivered by Botswana on behalf of the Group of Friends of R2P. I would now like to deliver the following statement in our national capacity. Since the unanimously adopted Security Council Resolution 1820 in 2008 on conflict-related sexual violence, CRSV, the Council has renewed and strengthened its commitment to eliminating CRSV through through several related resolutions in the years that followed. The key promise that these resolutions made was to prevent and eradicate such crimes. Nevertheless, it is distressing to note that the latest report from the Secretary General documented over 2,000 cases of CRSV again, including in the DRC, South Sudan, and Ukraine, with little significant reduction observed over the past decade. In particular, the Republic of Korea is deeply concerned about pervasive impunity for CRSV, which not only discourages the victims from reporting from the crimes, but also instills a fear of reprisals or the recurrence of violence. Impunity must not become the norm, and the CRSV should not be seen as an inevitable consequence of conflict. While ensuring accountability at both the local and national levels is crucial, my delegation also supports the Security Council's efforts to incorporate sexual and gender-based violence as a designation criterion for UN sanctions regimes. Targeted UN sanctions against those who perpetrate and direct sexual violence in conflict can address impunity as well as serve as a deterrent. The Republic of Korea would also like to emphasize the importance of a survivor-centered approach in addressing CRSV, as outlined in Security Council Resolution 2467. Heeding the voices of survivors and responding to their needs are essential to provide relevant support and help them reintegrate into communities. In this regard, the Republic of Korea takes pride in its continued contributions to the Global Survivors Fund since its inception. As one of the main donors for the fund, we have promoted its activities around the globe, which include providing the survivors with financial compensation, vocational training, and medical and psychological care. Last but not least, it is critical that survivors do not remain mere victims of the violence, but are transformed into agents of peace. To achieve this, we need to make our utmost effort to ensure the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women at all stages of the peace process. The Republic of Korea has created an international forum called Action with Women and Peace since 2018. At the 5th conference later this year, we look forward to hearing from more women, including survivors. Mr. President, as an elected member of the Security Council for the term 2024 to 25, the Republic of Korea looks forward to contributing to the Council's noble work of preventing CRSV and ensuring justice for all those affected. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Korea for their statements. Colleagues, we still have 20 speakers left to go, so I encourage you to stick to the limit of 3 minutes in your statements. Thank you very much. I give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and of the group of Friends of the Responsibility to Protect and wishes to add some additional remarks in its national capacity. We would like to start by thanking the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate on women, peace and security with focus on conflict-related sexual violence. We would also like to thank SRSG Patten as well as representatives of the civil society for their briefing. We seize this opportunity to express our deep concern that despite systematic advancement of the women, peace and security agenda, the heinous practice of sexual violence in conflict is still present and widespread. This was marked by the Secretary General in its latest report. We fully agree with the Secretary General that enhanced investment by the international community to break the vicious cycle of sexual violence and impunity is urgently needed. SRSG Patten also recently clearly stated that, quote, "Yet despite increased international awareness, the global trend lines of conflict-related sexual violence are worsening," end of quote. We consider it crucial to foster an enabling environment for victims and survivors and to provide them with accessible and quality multisectoral assistance. This includes all 17 conflict-affected countries as described in the report, including Afghanistan, DRC, Myanmar, Syria, or Sudan. Mr. President, as the co-chair of the Group of Friends of Security Sector Reform, Slovakia wishes to recall United Nations Security Council Resolution 2151 on SSR, which underscored the importance of women's equal, meaningful, and effective participation and full involvement in the security sector in order to build inclusive, accountable, and legitimate institutions that more effectively protect populations and promote lasting peace and sustainable development. Gender-responsive security sector reform is key to developing security sector institutions that are non-discriminatory, representatives, and capable of effectively responding to the specific security needs of diverse groups. It is critical to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment are not sidelined and that funding for WPS agenda is carefully allocated. I wish to underline that the Security Council mandates should explicitly recognize women's contribution to SSR processes and more clearly encourage peace operations to support women's meaningful participation and leadership in all stages of SSR processes. Mr. President, one of the questions that emerged from the concept note of today's open debate is how the Security Council responds to states that fail to hold perpetrators to account. This is a highly relevant query as one permanent member of the Security Council has blatantly violated the international law and principles of the UN Charter. The situation of many Ukrainian citizens has turned into living hell since the Russian Federation decided to start its senseless war of choice. The ongoing, unjustified, and unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine has resulted in serious violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including sexual violence. This constitutes not only a despicable act, but it can also qualify as a war crime or crime against humanity. We wish to stress once again that all perpetrators must be brought to justice and held accountable for crimes committed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
I thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me at the outset thank the UK Presidency, and in particular His Excellency Lord Ahmad, Minister of State and Special Representative of the Prime Minister on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict, for convening this open debate on this vital aspect of international peace and security. We thank SRSG Patten and other briefers for the information provided today. Mr. President, despite the Security Council's efforts since the adoption of Resolution 1820, there seems to be no end in sight for the growing number of victims of conflict-related sexual violence. The Secretary General's report has documented 2,455 cases of conflict-related sexual violence in 2022. These are only a small proportion of this underreported crime. The report lists 49 parties, including states and non-state actors, responsible for such crimes. However, the credibility of the report is seriously eroded because of what looks like a deliberate decision not to report the crimes of sexual violence being committed in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and in Israeli-occupied Palestine. There is ample documented evidence that since 1989, Indian occupation forces have used rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war in occupied Kashmir. Thousands of women and girls have been raped and gang raped and subjected to enforced incarceration, torture, and abduction. The infamous incident of Konun Pushpura is raw in the memories of all Kashmiris. Thousands of women and girls, boys and men, have been detained and subjected to sexual violence and torture as punishment and humiliation. Entire communities, women, girls, and boys, are prevented from their rights, including freedom of expression in religion, education, and employment. This is corroborated by the two reports of 2018 and 2019 issued by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is also corroborated by the international media and human rights organizations. And since India's unilateral and illegal measures of 5 August 2019, conflict-related violence and harassment and humiliation of women and girls in Kashmir has increased significantly. We would therefore urge the Secretary General to rectify the report submissions and include information on the incidents of sexual violence in foreign-occupied Kashmir and Palestine, and list India and Israel amongst those parties perpetrating conflict-related sexual violence in future reports to the Security Council. Mr. President, this open debate is a somber reminder of the need to take decisive action. We would urge all Security Council resolutions related to protracted conflicts should be faithfully implemented. The implementation of this issue should cover all 4 pillars of the WPS agenda. The gaps in oversight and investigation mechanisms should be addressed to end the culture of impunity. And finally, the provision of timely assistance, health services, rehabilitation, and reintegration in response to sexual violence in conflicts should be strengthened and adequately funded. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for their statements, and I give the floor to the representative of Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, we would like to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this important debate. We thank as well SRSG on sexual violence and conflict, Mrs. Pramila Patten, and the other briefers for their statements earlier today. Mr. President, we still remember SRSG Patten's words during last year's debate on ending cycles of sexual violence and conflict, when she stated, and I quote, "Women's rights are not Western rights, they are human rights," end of quote. We as Lebanon, a country that has played a role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that we are celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, strongly concurs with her. Mr. President, when we read the latest report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, where it is stated that impunity remains the norm, we ask ourselves, how many times are we going to keep on saying this? Survivor and Nobel Peace Prize Nadia Murad's word can bring some key answers to our questions. And I quote her, "Sometimes I feel as if I'm repeating myself over and over again, but the messages remain important. I will keep saying them until we solve the issues." End of quote. Mr. President, the devastating use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, a humiliating and degrading one, continues unabated, with women and girls being mainly the victim, without forgetting that men and boys can also be the target of sexual violence and conflict. Human beings' bodies are not and should never be considered a tool of combat. Mr. President, we commend the United Kingdom's leadership in preventing sexual violence and conflict. Lebanon participated in the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict initiative international conference that took place in London in November of last year and endorsed as well the political declaration on conflict-related sexual violence. Mr. President, one of the strongest pieces of the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York is the statue of Lucretia by French sculptor Philippe Bertrand from the early 18th century. The sculpture depicts Lucretia committing suicide out of shame for her rape. No victim, no survivor of sexual violence should ever have to go through this extra layer of pain and suffering. Our common duty is to understand what they have gone through, to support and empower them, and to prevent such atrocities to be committed ever again. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Lebanon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Mr. President, Kazakhstan thanks the UK presidency for convening today's open debate. We commend the Special Representative Patten for the insights drawn from Secretary General's annual report. We also thank our civil societies briefers for their passionate plea to us and horrifying analysis of this scourge in different parts of the world. Kazakhstan endorses the recommendation of the Secretary General's annual report. Despite the robust normative framework and the progress achieved, we need to collectively reflect on how to reduce conflict-related sexual violence. At the same time, we must take measures to ensure that sexual violence is not used as a tactic of war or aggravated by human trafficking, which can become a source of income by terrorist organizations and transnational organized crime networks. We also need to address new emerging threats from the largely ungoverned digital space. This scourge requires concerted and well-coordinated cross-national interventions with the one UN approach. There is also a need for improved coordination between UN entities, regional and sub-regional organizations, and civil society in prevention, assistance to victims, research advocacy, information sharing, capacity building, and exchange of good practices in combating sexual violence. Enhanced implementation of armed control and disarmament measures can contribute to both long-term structural prevention and short-term operational prevention of sexual violence in conflict. Our deliberations today make it clear that the international community should ensure accountability for sexual violence and conflict and bring a resolute end to impunity. Conflict-related sexual violence affects every aspect of survivor's life and leads to the stigmatization of victims and devastation of physical and economic security, especially of displaced and rural women. We therefore need a survivor-centered approach, which should include full, competent, and speedy attention for the victims, with increased access to health care, psychosocial support, legal assistance, and socioeconomic reintegration. Cooperation with religious leaders, civil society, and local communities is most important to exchange extremist narratives, shift the stigma of sexual violence to the perpetrators, promote education, and increase awareness of the empowerment of women. Kazakhstan strongly believes that preventing sexual exploitation and abuse by the peacekeepers should be an absolute priority with the UN zero-tolerance policy for such offenses. All troops and police contingents should have full training prior and during deployment. We support the greater recruitment of well-qualified women military and police officers and the deployment of women's protection advisors to the peacekeeping missions. Our country integrates all elements of the WPS agenda, including on conflict-related sexual violence, in our national legislation with the new strong pro-women policies. Training on gender equality for the armed and security forces and women's deployment in UN peacekeeping operations are a priority for Kazakhstan at KASCENT, our national peacekeeping training center. At the regional level, we are supporting Afghanistan with multidimensional approach of conflict prevention and resolution, recovery, reintegration, accompanied by humanitarian and development assistance through strengthening the security and development nexus. At the international level, we are contributing to the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women that funds projects in the post-conflict settings. To conclude, I reiterate Kazakhstan's strong commitment to fully implement the WPS agenda and promote women's dignity and gender empowerment. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kazakhstan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Cambodia.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellency, distinguished delegate. First, my delegation would like to thank you, Mr. President, for convening today's debates on conflict-related sexual violence, promoting the implementation of Security Council resolution on conflict-related sexual violence. We highly appreciate the Secretary General timely report on CRSV and the effort of UN action against sexual violence in conflict. May I also thank all the briefer and speakers before me for sharing their insight on the topic. We all know that it is difficult to reduce conflict-related sexual violence when there are so many active conflict and instability around the world. The trend of using sexual violence against women and girls as a means of terror and retribution is alarming. Thus, I cannot agree more with Ms. Pramila Patten, the Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, the view that more action are needed. Mr. President, please allow me to highlight a few points. First, on prevention, member states should prioritize working together on the prevention of conflict and the escalation of existing conflicts. It is important to strengthen national legislation to ensure accountability for sexual crimes committed by members of the armed force. Education and training with the involvement of women and victims should be mainstreamed within the armed forces, including those deployed as part of the international peacekeeping mission. Second, on victim support, members of the armed forces should also be part of the efforts to assist victim recovery and integration. More women, especially those from the armed forces, should be encouraged to get involved in this endeavor. Third, enhancing accountability is the most difficult issue. Ideally, state and non-state actors condoning sexual abuses or weaponizing them for attrition or retribution should be made accountable. However, the challenges lie in the process being politicized, the question of victim safety, and the needs for victim-centered approaches. In conclusion, Cambodia strongly condemns all forms of sexual violence and calls for end to all conflicts. We believe that conflict and instability are major factors that contribute to sexual violence, and the peace and stability are essential to preventing this crime. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Cambodia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Mr. President, our gratitude to the United Kingdom for convening an open debate in the Security Council on conflict-related sexual violence. We also express our appreciation to SRSG, Pramila Patten, and all the distinguished briefers for their valuable contribution and insightful perspectives. Sexual violence in armed conflicts perpetrated by state and non-state actors poses grave security challenges, and it is indeed disconcerting that sexual violence continues amidst a thriving culture of impunity in armed conflicts. Over the past decade, the Security Council has put in place a strong framework to combat this menace, but the level of compliance by parties to the conflict remains alarmingly low. We feel that the Council must absolutely focus on identifying and bridging the implementation gaps to prevent such atrocities and facilitate the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors. Allow me to make 6 proposals very quickly. 1. National governments have the primary responsibility for prosecuting and deterring such crimes in conflict situations in their territories, even if these are alleged to have been committed by non-state actors. 2. Member states should ensure effective prosecution of sexual violence as a standalone crime. There must be no impunity for the perpetrators, and states should ensure accountability in line with their international obligations and in line with their duty to uphold the rule of law. 3. The UN, upon request, must assist national authorities in conflict areas in developing capabilities to strengthen their national investigative and legal frameworks and related structures for speedy investigation and prosecution of perpetrators. 4. As survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are not a homogeneous group, countries must adopt a tailored, victim-centered approach to preventing and responding to sexual violence in armed conflicts, in line with Security Council Resolution 2467 that calls for strengthening justice and accountability and for a survivor-centered approach in the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence. 5. States must ensure adequate focus and resources for comprehensive and non-discriminatory assistance for victims of sexual violence by providing for inter alia, medical, psychological, social, and legal services. And 6, sexual violence primarily directed against women and girls and also against men and boys by terrorists remains a cause of concern. The nexus between terrorism, trafficking, and sexual violence in armed conflicts needs to be broken. Going forward, Mr. President, we would recommend that a greater participation of women in conflict resolution and post-conflict reconciliation processes should be promoted to address deep-rooted inequality and subordination in society. It is important to make this a precondition for any peace process to succeed. As well, mainstreaming of the gender perspective in peace operations and increasing the representation of women in peacekeeping are prerequisites for prevention and response. In this vein, India welcomes the UN's Uniformed Gender Parity Strategy to increase the number of women peacekeepers. We also support increasing the deployment of women protection advisors for effective monitoring, analysis, and reporting arrangements on sexual violence in armed conflict. The experience of India's deployment of an all-women police contingent in Liberia illustrates the enormous positive impact that deployment of women peacekeepers can have on the effective participation of women in civilian and political life in a post-conflict situation. We would also add, and in order to promote synergy and effective coordination, that it is important to avoid duplication in the working of various UN organs. The issue of violence against women, including sexual violence, is discussed by other UN bodies, including at the Human Rights Council. Deliberations at the Security Council, therefore, should remain focused on such atrocities perpetrated in situations of armed conflict threatening international peace and security. In conclusion, Mr. President, I strongly reaffirm India's unwavering commitment to actively contribute to our collective efforts in effectively addressing sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. Lastly, I would like to address the frivolous remarks made by a representative from another delegation concerning my country. I will not dwell on this for long, but I feel it necessary to dismiss such remarks with the contempt they deserve. A country that fails to safeguard the rights of its women and girls, allowing forced religious conversions and tolerating sexual and gender-based violence, has no credibility to pass judgment on any other nation, least of all my own. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Yemen.
شكرا. السيد الرئيس، اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أشكركم على عقد هذا الاجتماع الهام، كما أود شكر السيدة براميلا باتن الممثل الخاص للأمين العام المعني بالعنف الجنسي في حالة النزاع وبقية المشاركات على إحاطتهن. سيد الرئيس، تولي الحكومة اليمنية اهتماما كبيرا بالمرأة، ويتجلى ذلك بالتزامها منذ وقت مبكر على تصميم الخطة الوطنية للمرأة والسلام والأمن وفقا للقرار 1325 والمبنية على الركائز الأربع، وهي الحماية والمشاركة والوقاية والتعافي. وقد تم إعداد المعايير المرجعية للخطة وتشكيل اللجان العاملة بالتنسيق مع الشركاء الحكوميين من صانعي القرار من مختلف الوزارات، بما في ذلك اللجنة الوطنية للمرأة والجهات الأمنية ومنظمات المجتمع المدني النسائية والشبابية والأوساط الأكاديمية والقطاع الخاص. وتعمل وزارة الشؤون الاجتماعية والعمل حالياً على الإشراف المباشر على أنشطة وفعالية الفريق الوطني المعني بتنفيذ أجندة الخطة الوطنية للمرأة والسلام والأمن، وتفعيل دور اللجان المركزية والمحلية لتنفيذ الأنشطة وفقاً للخطة
والتنسيق والمتابعة. سيد الرئيس، إن العنف الجنسي انتهاك مهين ومروع لحقوق الإنسان، كما أنه يطرح تحديات كبيرة في تحقيق أهداف التنمية المستدامة لعام 2030 والمتصلة بتحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين وتقليل أوجه عدم المساواة وتوفير فرص الوصول إلى العدالة من خلال بناء مؤسسات فعالة وخاضعة للمساءلة على كافة المستويات. سيد الرئيس، أحيط وفد بلادي علما بتقرير الأمين العام المعني بالعنف الجنسي المتصل بالنزاع، ونثمن جهود السيدة باتن ونلفت انتباه المجلس الموقر تأكيد الجمهورية اليمنية التزامها بخيار السلام وحرصها على التعاطي الإيجابي والبناء مع كل الجهود والمساعي الإقليمية والدولية وجهود المبعوث الخاص للأمين العام للأمم المتحدة إلى اليمن وفقا لمرجعيات الحل السياسي المتفق عليها. كما نؤكد أن التقاليد والأعراف في المجتمع اليمني تمنع المساس أو انتهاك كرامة النساء اليمنيات وتجرم القوانين الوطنية الاعتداء الجنسي عليهن. سيد الرئيس، تواصل الميليشيات الحوثية الانتهاكات المتعددة للقانون الدولي الإنساني وقانون حقوق الإنسان، بما في ذلك الانتهاكات التي ترتكبها هذه الميليشيات ضد النساء والفتيات وحرمانهن من حقوقهن السياسية والاقتصادية والاجتماعية، والتي وردت في التقارير الوطنية والتقارير الصادرة عن الجهات الدولية المعنية بحقوق الإنسان. كما تمت الإشارة إلى جملة من الانتهاكات في تقارير فريق الخبراء المعني باليمن، وكان آخرها لعام 2022 وتقرير الممثل الخاص الأمين العام المعني بالعنف الجنسي في النزاع لهذا العام، وذلك على النحو الآتي: أولاً، تعريض النساء للتمييز والتهميش، فقد فرضت الميليشيات الحوثية قيوداً مشددة لتضييق الخناق على النساء اليمنيات في مناطق سيطرتها وحرية التنقل والسفر بين المدن والمحافظات وإلى خارج البلاد دون محرم، وحرمانهن من أبسط حقوقهن الأساسية وفرض ممارسات اجتماعية قاسية، وتعريضهن للتمييز الجنسي والعنف بما في ذلك الفصل بين الجنسين في المرافق التعليمية والمؤسسات الحكومية، وحرمانهن من حقهن في التعليم الجيد ومزاولة العمل خارج المنزل والمشاركة السياسية والاجتماعية والإسهام في بناء وتنوير المجتمع وفي الحياة العامة. ثانياً، العنف الجنسي. تم توثيق حالات عديدة من الاعتداءات الجنسية والاستغلال الجنسي التي ترتكبها الميليشيات الحوثية ضد النساء والفتيات في مناطق سيطرتها كوسيلة للترهيب والقهر في انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي الإنساني. فعلى سبيل المثال الحصر، الاختطاف والاعتقال التعسفي للمواطن انتصار الحمادي وأخريات وإخضاعهن لمحاكمة جائرة من قبل الميليشيات الحوثية بزعم ارتكاب عمل غير لائق وحيازة مخدرات، والحكم عليهن ب5 سنوات. ثالثاً، الاختطاف والاعتقال التعسفي، حيث تقوم هذه الميليشيات بالقبض على النساء والفتيات بشكل تعسفي ودون أسباب قانونية وتلفيق التهم الكيدية لهن واحتجازهن في سجون سرية بظروف قاسية وغير إنسانية على خلفية نشاطهن السياسي والإعلامي والحقوقي. رابعاً، قمع الحريات الأساسية بما في ذلك حرية التعبير عن آرائهن من خلال حملات تشويه سمعة الناشطات والمدافعات عن حقوق النساء وعرقلة أعمالهن وزعزعة الثقة بهن وبالقضايا التي يدافعن عنها. السيد الرئيس، يؤكد قرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2564 للعام 2021 المتعلق بنظام قائمة الجزاءات المعني باليمن، والذي فرض عقوبات على القيادي الحوثي سلطان زابن بسبب الحملة الممنهجة الشنيعة من الاعتقالات والحجز والتعذيب والعنف الجنسي والاغتصاب التي مارستها إدارة التحقيق الجنائي في مناطق سيطرة الميليشيات الحوثية. يؤكد هذا القرار بأن المجتمع الدولي وهذا المجلس الموقر لن يتساهل تجاه ممارسات التعذيب والعنف الجنسي الفظيعة في مناطق سيطرة الميليشيات، كما أن القرار ينتصف لشيء من حقوق النساء اليمنيات في هذه المناطق. ونؤكد على أهمية الاستمرار في إدراج القيادات الحوثية الضالعة في هذه الممارسات لضمان المساءلة وتحقيق العدالة للضحايا، حيث ما زالت العديد من الناشطات يقبعن في سجون هذه الميليشيات ويتعرضن لأنواع التعذيب الجسدي والعنف الجنسي والاغتصاب. ختاماً السيد الرئيس، إن تعزيز التعاون الدولي للتصدي للعنف الجنسي المتصل بالنزاعات خطوة هامة لتحقيق التغيير الحقيقي والمستدام للنساء والفتيات من خلال تبادل المعلومات والخبرات وتقديم الدعم الفني والمالي للدول التي تعاني من الصراع أو ما بعد الصراع. وفي هذا الصدد نشكر كافة الشركاء الإقليميين والدوليين وعلى وجه الخصوص الحكومة النرويجية لدعم اليمن في تنفيذ ومتابعة الخطة الوطنية حول المرأة والسلام والأمن بالخبرة والتمويل. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Yemen for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President, and thank you to our briefers today. We take this opportunity to reiterate our steadfast commitment to Special Representative Patten and to the work of her office, which is so indispensable in shining a light on what is so often obscured. I commend the contribution of our civil society briefers today, whose bravery is remarkable. You remind us that our approach to these most heinous of crimes must always be survivor-centred and prioritise your needs, perspectives and aspirations. Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union, as well as the groups of friends of women, peace and security, and the responsibility to protect. As the Secretary-General has outlined in his report, 2022 has exposed civilians to heightened levels of sexual and gender-based violence against the backdrop of shrinking civil society space and collapsing rule of law in conflict settings. Across the globe, whether in DRC, Haiti, Myanmar, Ukraine or elsewhere, sexual and gender-based violence continues to be brandished as a weapon and tactic of war, and impunity regrettably remains the norm. First and foremost, we repeat the call on all parties to conflict to immediately cease all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. Furthermore, all states must commit to a zero-tolerance policy for crimes of sexual and gender-based violence in line with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law. This has been set out in numerous Security Council resolutions since the adoption of Resolution 1820 in 2008. Yet while our commitment to eliminating all forms of conflict-related sexual violence remains resolute on paper, translating this to reality remains a challenge. Civilians on the ground, mostly women and girls, continue to suffer, including in new and emerging manifestations, whether that be online, through the acts of mercenaries and private military companies, or in gang warfare. Where acts of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict are ignored or even emboldened, this scourge will persist. Access to justice for survivors and accountability for perpetrators is absolutely essential. Though we have seen some encouraging developments in strengthening rule of law institutions and national legislations on protection and reparations, there remains much more to do in this space. In that regard, we welcome the recent launch of the Guidebook on State Obligations on Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. President, where national efforts fail, the international community has a duty to step up, and in particular this Council. 8 sanctions regimes of this Council include conflict-related sexual violence within their designation criteria. We believe this should be a prerequisite across all regimes, and that the Council should continue to designate individuals who are specifically responsible for acts of sexual and gender-based violence, as done recently in Haiti and Yemen. The Council and its subsidiary bodies should continue close collaboration with the Special Representative and her office, and give due consideration to a dedicated field visit on the topic of CRSV. Critically, resource and budgetary commitments to deploying women protection advisors to UN missions and offices should match the political commitment we heard around this table today. Otherwise, we simply pay lip service to what is a serious threat, not just to individual security, but to international peace and security. Finally, President, we wish to recognise the outstanding work undertaken by women-led organisations at the coalface dealing with conflict-related sexual violence. These organisations provide meaningful and sometimes life-saving support to survivors in the absence of more lasting solutions, often facing reprisals of their own. We encourage Member States to keep such organisations to the forefront of considerations in all humanitarian and development funding and efforts. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Presidency of the United Kingdom for organizing this important open debate. I also thank Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary-General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and other briefers for their comprehensive and insightful remarks. Bangladesh aligns itself with the statement made by Canada on behalf of the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, and with the statement delivered by Botswana on behalf of Group of Friends on Responsibility to Protect. Mr. President, we had the horrific experience of sexual violence in conflict during our liberation war in 1971. More than 200,000 of our mothers and sisters were violated during this war. However, in a war-ravaged country with a lot of limitations, our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, took immediate action to meet the urgent need of the victims and established a rehabilitation board for relief and reconstruction of war-affected women. The board arranged rehabilitation of the victims, including remedial measures to address physical and psychological trauma. Besides the victim support approach, most of the perpetrators of the sexual violence have been brought to justice through a trial process. The contribution of victims in our independence has also been recognized officially. In line with our commitment to prevent and stop sexual violence in conflict, we have always been an ardent advocate and supporter of WPS agenda. We proudly recall the Security Council adopted the historic and landmark Resolution 1325 on WPS in 2000, when Bangladesh was a member of the Council and played an important role to advance the issue. Regrettably, years later, we had to witness the worst form of sexual violence against the Rohingyas in our neighboring Myanmar. We have been providing all critical support to those 1.2 million Rohingyas who have taken shelter in Bangladesh. SRSG Pramila Patten has also visited the Rohingya camps in Cox's Bazar and heard firsthand from the victims. We have been repeatedly urging the Myanmar authorities to ensure their safe, voluntary, and sustainable return. Unfortunately, it's been more than 6 years. No progress has been made for repatriation. Not a single Rohingya has returned due to lack of conducive conditions in Myanmar. I refer to the Secretary General's call to allow immediate and unconstrained access to United Nations mandated investigatory and reporting bodies to humanitarian actors for providing support to affected populations. At the same time, we would like to see the perpetrators of sexual violence are held accountable in Myanmar. Mr. President, it is unfortunate that sexual violence continued to be used as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism. The Secretary General's latest report mentioned that in most contexts, impunity remained the norm, while emerging threats in the largely ungoverned digital space and the combination of climate insecurity, state fragility, and structural gender inequality further exposed women and girls to conflict-related sexual violence. In this context, allow me to highlight a few points. First, state has the primary responsibility to prevent and respond to the conflict-related sexual violence. In this connection, it is imperative to ensure capacity building of the state to effectively address the root causes as well as to meet the needs of victims in order to bring them into normal life. National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security can also play a critical role in the efforts of member states to address sexual violence in conflict. Second, we urge to take necessary steps in addressing the gender-based digital divide. Gender-based hate speech and incitement to violence are fueling the conflict in many places. At the same time, victims are disproportionately affected by the lack of access to digital tools and resources, hindering their access to life-saving security and public health information and networks, among others. Third, while we are condemning that impunity for conflict-related sexual violence remain the norm, we need to ensure accountability through ensuring gender-sensitive and efficient security and judicial sector and strengthening legal framework and justice mechanisms in national context. The Security Council needs to use its mandate and authority when national justice mechanism is unable to deliver. Fourth, we highlight the role of UN peacekeepers in providing life-saving services as well as psychological support to the victims of conflict-related sexual violence in various war-ravaged zones. In this regard, we refer to the recommendation of the Secretary General to include dedicated operational provisions on gender-responsive security and justice sector reform to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence in mandate authorizations and renewals of peace operations, as well as in transition plans. We also underscore the importance of deployment of women's protection advisors to peace operations. Fifth, We call for greater coordination and complementarity among the UN mechanisms, especially in the field under the reinvigorated RC system, to complement Council's work to address the conflict-related sexual violence. We also call for greater synergies between the mandated UN entities and the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Finally, we underscore the role of the Peacebuilding Commission to help implementing the Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2467 of 2019 through its advices. The Peacebuilding Commission's advice can bring the voice of women briefers and women organizations to the Security Council. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Morocco.
Monsieur le Président, tout d'abord, ma délégation voudrait remercier le Royaume-Uni pour l'organisation de ce débat sur une question de la plus haute importance, celle de l'élimination des violences sexuelles en temps de conflit. Je voudrais également rendre un hommage particulier aux représentants de la société civile qui ont partagé avec nous leurs témoignages émouvants. Le rapport annuel du secrétaire général des Nations Unies de juin 2023 montre que l'histoire se répète malheureusement avec d'autres cas malheureux de violences sexuelles, de viols et de torture qui dépeignent une image d'une sauvagerie et d'une brutalité inacceptable, illustrant une chronique de violences sexuelles en temps de conflit. Au cours de la dernière décennie, il y a eu un changement de paradigme important et des avancées enregistrées grâce notamment au mandat de la représentante spéciale sur la violence sexuelle dans les conflits et aux résolutions pertinentes du Conseil de sécurité qui ont succédé à la 1325. Aujourd'hui, la violence sexuelle dans les conflits armés et les situations d'après-conflit est considérée comme une menace pour la paix et la sécurité internationale. Toutefois, face à la persistance de ces actes odieux, l'indignation ne suffit plus. Il faut renforcer notre action commune et proposer de vraies solutions pragmatiques et surtout durables afin de prévenir et réprimer les actes de violence sexuelle et aider les survivants à se reconstruire et à s'intégrer pleinement dans leur communauté tout en préservant leurs droits et leur dignité. À cet égard, permettez-moi de souligner les points suivants. Premièrement, la communauté internationale gagnerait à suivre une approche plus complète et holistique qui prévient les conflits et s'attaque à leurs causes profondes. La prévention des conflits constitue un pilier central de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité, mais aussi de l'agenda 2030, dont les ODD, notamment les objectifs 5 et 16, accordent une grande place à la prévention des conflits et prouvent que la question de la femme, la paix, la sécurité et le développement sont liés, interconnectés et indissociables. Deuxièmement, il faut inclure les femmes dans les processus de prise de décision, notamment en favorisant et encourageant les initiatives nationales visant à mettre fin à la discrimination fondée sur le genre. Il est également crucial de soutenir la participation des femmes au débat sur le règlement des conflits, le maintien de la paix et de la sécurité, la consolidation de la paix au lendemain des conflits. Troisièmement, il faut lutter contre l'impunité, consacrer la politique de tolérance zéro et assurer l'accès à la justice pour les victimes. En même temps, la stigmatisation qui entoure les victimes des violences sexuelles et les enfants nés de ces violences doit être corrigée, car elle constitue une nouvelle victimisation. Ces derniers doivent être accompagnés médicalement et réinsérés socialement et économiquement. Enfin, les leaders religieux ont un rôle influent à jouer dans la lutte contre les abus de la religion pour justifier les violences et les discriminations fondées sur le genre. Ils doivent être encouragés à s'exprimer fermement contre ces crimes odieux. En outre, les acteurs locaux et les leaders communautaires doivent jouer un rôle crucial, étant donné qu'ils peuvent identifier les signes de précurseurs d'actes de violence sexuelle, offrir des systèmes d'alerte rapides et proposer des stratégies de prévention appropriées. Monsieur le Président, le Royaume du Maroc condamne fortement toutes les formes de violence sexuelle, y compris en période de conflit, et les considère comme méthodes et pratiques barbares, brutales et inhumaines, ayant des conséquences graves sur le processus d'instauration d'une paix et réconciliation durable. convaincu de la contribution des femmes en tant que mécanisme primordiaux et d'alerte rapide, leur responsabilité aux menaces sur la sécurité locale et leur rôle dans la médiation, le Maroc participe activement dans le cadre de nombreuses initiatives, notamment l'initiative sur la promotion de la médiation en Méditerranée, le réseau des points focaux Femmes, Paix, Sécurité et le réseau des femmes méditerranéennes. Depuis la création des forces armées royales en 1956 et l'intégration précoce du personnel féminin dans cette institution, l'inclusion progressive de la femme au sein des forces armées royales est montée crescendo. En effet, Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI, chef suprême et chef d'état-major général des forces armées royales, a bien voulu donner ses instructions pour autoriser le personnel féminin à participer au concours d'accès aux grandes écoles militaires dans les mêmes conditions que son homologue masculin. Ainsi, les femmes militaires marocaines sont aujourd'hui représentées bien au sein de l'administration de la défense nationale que dans toutes les composantes des phares, terre, air, marine, gendarmerie royale. Enfin, elles sont également présentes dans les missions de maintien de la paix de l'ONU, aussi bien en RDC qu'en République centrafricaine, dans lesquelles le contingent marocain est employé. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
I thank the representative of Morocco for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, we thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General for her briefing this morning. Taking note of the report of the Secretary General, we would like to convey our thanks to the Office of the SRSG for the participatory working methods and consultations that allowed us to react to the draft report prior to its finalization. It's, however, regrettable, despite our engagement, the report does not incorporate our inputs and serious concerns. I therefore would like to put on record our strong reservations about the scope and content of the report dealing with Ethiopia and the reference to the International Commission of Human Rights expert on Ethiopia. We do not recognize this commission and any of its substandard work. We thus caution the SRSG from using such devious sources. In the last 2 years, Ethiopia was faced with extraordinary security challenges. But the government of Ethiopia has, despite the challenges, made concerted efforts to ensure respect and protect the rights of women in vulnerable situations. Unhindered humanitarian aid has been expedited to all people in need of assistance. The implementation of the November 2022 peace agreement has enabled the further provision of humanitarian aid, the restoration of services, and the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former combatants are underway. We have also charted a clear path for accountability for alleged human rights violations. On women's rights, we followed a four-tiered approach that encompassed accountability and victim support. One of these avenues is the Interministerial Task Force, the IMTF, that is implementing the recommendations of the Joint Investigation Report of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights. Secondly, we have the military justice system that is ensuring accountability within its own mechanisms. In this process, we have pending and closed prosecutions against suspected perpetrators of alleged crimes against women. The third such avenue is the regular law enforcement mechanisms that are coordinated with the IMTF on the persecution of suspects and the provision of remedies for victims. The fourth tier consists of the works of the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs of Ethiopia, leads cross-sectional initiatives to provide rehabilitation and comprehensive support for victims. All these processes will further be consolidated in the mechanisms to be established under the Transitional Justice Policy. The options for this Transitional Justice Policy are being discussed in nationwide consultations. It is expected for the policy will take its final form in August and implementation to start in September. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights are providing technical assistance to ensure these consultations conform to international standards. Reconstruction and recovery programs have also given adequate place for sectors such as health, education, and economic sectors that have a special focus on women. We also have intensified our efforts to provide psychological support, legal assistance, and socioeconomic support. Finally, Mr. President, I would like to reiterate that Ethiopia has unwavering commitment to the respect, protection, and fulfillment of all the human rights of women and to women's equal and meaningful participation in all political processes. It is on this basis we will further scrutinize the report with a view to addressing any relevant aspects of recommendations contained therein. While we commit to continue our engagement with the Office of the SRSG, we hope the Special Representative will sufficiently reflect the inputs we provide and operate within the defined scope. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ethiopia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the outset, Thailand wishes to express its appreciation to the United Kingdom for convening this open debate on this important issue of conflict-related sexual violence. I also thank the Secretary General for his recent report, as well as all the briefers for their contributions. Despite all the efforts that we have made towards elimination of all acts of violence against civilians in armed conflict, it is clear from the Secretary General's report that conflict-related sexual violence remains persistent and widespread. This sad reality is also echoed in his annual report on children in armed conflict, which was distributed just last month. Girls continue to be disproportionately affected by sexual violence in conflicts. This cannot continue. Thailand unequivocally condemns sexual violence, both in times of conflict and in times of peace, as well as the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. The growing trend of such criminal acts is indeed worrisome, and more should be done to address this issue. We strongly believe that the international community and all parties involved in conflict must strengthen their efforts in implementing the relevant Security Council resolutions to ensure the protection of civilians. In this regard, I wish to highlight the following 4 points. First, prevention is key. Thailand believes that the protection and promotion of women's rights, the empowerment of women, and the advancement of gender equality are fundamental elements to combating sexual violence. Therefore, it is essential to reduce pre-existing structural inequalities, eradicate all forms of discrimination, and combat extreme poverty among women and girls. We need to recognize that their meaningful participation within our societies as active agents of change is fundamental for our prevention efforts. Second, we must protect and guarantee the rights of survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. To avoid marginalization and stigmatization of victims, survivor-centered approaches need to be employed to ensure their access to services and justice. In parallel, effective investigation and prosecution of sexual violence crimes need to be reinforced to uphold the perpetrators accountable as well as to prevent the recurrence of this human rights violation. Third, Thailand wishes to reiterate our full support to the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and continues to look for ways to strengthen our commitment. We fully recognize the role of women as security providers and peace builders, not just as victims. Specific measures should be undertaken to ensure women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all levels of peace and security dialogue and processes. In this connection, we support the recommendation to increase deployment of women peacekeepers in line with the Uniformed Gender Parity Strategy 2018-2028. We commend the work of women's protection advisors in all UN peacekeeping operations and special political missions and encourage further deployment of WPAs. Fourth and lastly, as a troop and police contributing country, Thailand adheres to the policy of zero tolerance of sexual exploitation and abuse in UN peacekeeping operations. In the meantime, we are convinced that all military and police personnel throughout the entire chain of command, regardless of their gender, should receive adequate training to effectively prevent and respond to sexual violence. In this regard, Thailand supports the call to provide technical support and capacity building for troop and police contributing countries through both pre-deployment and in-mission training. Mr. President, in closing, sexual violence against people of any gender, whether in times of conflict or peace, has no justification. We all must do our part and step up our efforts to end the cycles of sexual violence in all instances once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Thailand for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Thank you very much. Australia thanks the United Kingdom for convening today's open debate and for its continued leadership on conflict-related sexual violence. Notwithstanding the many Security Council resolutions and the comprehensive nature of states' obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law, women and girls continue to be subjected to sexual violence in conflict-affected settings, including in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Ukraine and Sudan. Australia strongly condemns the harassment, the use of force and rape as instruments of repression and political intimidation against women peace builders and human rights defenders. The targeting of public health facilities, impeding access to services by survivors, is unacceptable. Australia's commitment to eliminating sexual violence in conflict is long-standing. We are committed to addressing technology-facilitated gender-based violence, delivering justice, and holding perpetrators to account. We welcome the deployment of women's protection advisors in UN peacekeeping missions. Australia's Defence Force, our Federal Police and our Department of Foreign Affairs train and deploy gender advisors on military, police, humanitarian, relief and recovery and crisis operations and missions. We also prioritise efforts to create more diverse and inclusive military and police institutions through our support to the ELSI Initiative Fund and to UN Women, to accelerate the meaningful representation of uniformed women across all levels of UN peace operations. Australia is also a founding member of the Call to Action on Protection from Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. Survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are not a homogenous group, hence the need for responding to intersecting forms of discrimination and tailored survivor-centred action. This includes employing the MURAD Code and ensuring that persons subjected to sexual violence in conflict have access to safe, comprehensive support and services. We encourage Member States to promote accountability for sexual and gender-based violence and for the Security Council to continue to counter impunity with all the means at its disposal. We are particularly concerned about the link between private military security companies and reports of sexual violence. Existing frameworks, such as the Montreux document, are important tools to help close the gap on attribution and accountability. Efforts to prevent and resolve conflict cannot be separated from efforts to address sexual and gender-based violence. We must do more. We must implement the Security Council resolutions that condemn conflict-related sexual violence and fully implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos la convocatoria de este importante debate abierto, así como las exposiciones de la representante especial, señora Pramila Patten, y de los representantes de la sociedad civil. Agradecemos también el trabajo que realiza la señora Patten. A lo largo de la historia, la violación y la violencia sexual han sido usadas como armas de guerra y frecuentemente como una estrategia deliberada en la conducción de las hostilidades. Desde la adopción de la Resolución 1820 del Consejo de Seguridad, ha habido una creciente conciencia en la opinión pública sobre estos delitos y sobre sus consecuencias. La violencia sexual perpetúa el conflicto y la inestabilidad. Su naturaleza destructiva a largo plazo tiene efectos devastadores, no solo en los sobrevivientes de este crimen, sino en comunidades enteras. A pesar de los numerosos instrumentos internacionales que exigen la protección de los civiles contra ataques de índole sexual en los conflictos armados y que reconocen que estos actos pueden constituir crímenes de guerra, la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos continúa prevaleciendo en una cultura de casi total impunidad. La violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos puede estar exacerbada en contextos donde impera una drástica desigualdad de género, lo que contribuye a su normalización. La desigualdad de género es una causa subyacente de los delitos sexuales y a la vez un obstáculo para su prevención. La prevención de la violencia sexual sistemática y generalizada comienza en tiempos de paz, mediante la puesta en vigencia de leyes nacionales que sean lo suficientemente robustas en cuanto a la criminalización de estas conductas. Los Estados deben tener mecanismos legislativos e instituciones judiciales preparados para abordar de manera integral esta problemática. Los delitos asociados con la violencia sexual tienen un impacto de género. Las discusiones sobre estos delitos típicamente se focalizan en la violencia ejercida por hombres contra mujeres y niñas. Sin embargo, es necesario expandir las discusiones para incluir los impactos de estos actos criminales cuando están dirigidos también contra hombres, niños y personas LGBTIQ+. En estos casos existe un alto nivel de subregistro que, sumado a las represalias, la discriminación y la estigmatización, contribuye a la impunidad generalizada de los perpetradores. La rendición de cuentas de los perpetradores de actos de violencia sexual es vital para hacer justicia a las víctimas y disuadir la comisión de futuros crímenes. Estos delitos son pasibles de responsabilidad penal individual bajo el derecho internacional y los Estados tienen la obligación primaria de enjuiciar a los perpetradores. Cuando un Estado no tiene la voluntad o la capacidad de investigar y enjuiciar crímenes internacionales, incluidos los delitos sexuales relacionados con los conflictos, la comunidad internacional debería tomar los recaudos necesarios para remitir la situación a la Corte Penal Internacional. El Estatuto de Roma criminaliza claramente la violación y cualquier otra forma de violencia sexual como crímenes de guerra y delitos de lesa humanidad. Uno de los espacios donde los actos de violencia sexual ocurren son las escuelas o en el camino hacia y desde las escuelas. La resolución 2601 del Consejo de Seguridad sobre la protección de la educación durante los conflictos armados expresa preocupación por las consecuencias de los ataques que las mujeres y niñas pueden sufrir, incluida la violación y otras formas de violencia sexual, los cuales pueden impedir la continuación de su educación. A este respecto, queremos llamar la atención sobre la Declaración de Escuelas Seguras, un compromiso político intergubernamental que busca garantizar una educación segura y prevenir la violencia sexual en los conflictos. En ese sentido, alentamos a todos los Estados que aún no lo han hecho a adherir a este documento que ya cuenta con más de 100 adhesiones. Para concluir, queremos recordar que en 2015, con el impulso de la Argentina y el Reino Unido, la Asamblea General adoptó la Resolución 69/293, por medio de la cual proclamó el 19 de junio de cada año como el Día Internacional para la Eliminación de la Violencia Sexual en los Conflictos, con el fin de concientizar sobre la necesidad de poner fin a la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos, honrar a las víctimas y los supervivientes de la violencia sexual y rendir homenaje a todos quienes han dedicado su vida con valentía a la lucha para erradicar estos delitos y han perdido la vida en esa empresa. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank the representative of Argentina for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the briefer for their input. Mr. President, armed conflict have a devastating and disproportionate impact on women and girls, rendering them the primary victims of violence, displacement, and human rights violations. The use of sexual violence as a tactic in such conflicts is an abhorrent crime disproportionately affect women and girls who bear the brunt of its horrific brutality. Iran strongly condemns all forms of sexual violence perpetrated during armed conflict and calls upon all parties to the conflict to comply with their obligation under international law. Within our volatile region, the Middle East, the threat posed by the foreign occupation, interference, and terrorism gravely jeopardize the rights and safety of women, disregarding their security needs. Mr. President, addressing this inhuman practice necessitates a collaborative approach. The Security Council resolution relevant to armed conflict explicitly underscored the imperative of combating conflict-related sexual violence and emphasizing accountability for these heinous acts. The primary goal is to foster an environment that effectively prevents and responds to such violence while safeguarding and empowering victims. However, achieving success in prevention hinges upon addressing the root causes of primary armed conflict themselves. Consequently, the ultimate solution to curbing these crimes lies in the complete elimination of armed conflicts. Unfortunately, as long as terrorism, violent extremism, foreign occupation, and foreign interference persist, obtaining this solution remains elusive. In the interim, our effort must be concentrated on advancing women's empowerment, initiatives such as enhancing access to education, economic opportunities, and healthcare services. Moreover, specific measures such as strengthening the rule of law, ensuring the effective functioning of the justice system, and providing comprehensive support to victims are pivotal in protecting women and girls from sexual violence during armed conflicts. Equally vital is the promotion of accountability, which serves as a crucial aspect of addressing conflict-related sexual violence. It is of utmost importance that the international community responds decisively, particularly in cases where these reprehensible crimes are perpetrated by foreign occupying forces in conflict zones. In conclusion, Mr. President, we categorically refute the groundless allegation and unjustified references made against Iran in the Secretary General's recent reports on sexual violence in armed conflict. This allegation is absolutely false and was made without solid evidence and based solely on unreliable and distorted information from media sources. Considering the report's specific focus on the sexual violence in armed conflict, it is deeply concerning. The SRSG has overstepped its mandate by bringing unfounded claims to a member state that have nothing to do with armed conflicts. We strongly object to and condemn such irresponsible actions which undermine the integrity of the report and the UN in general. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Myanmar.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to thank the United Kingdom for organizing this annual debate on important issue of conflict-related sexual violence. I also thank SRSG's Pramila Patten and civil society representatives, including one from Myanmar, for their insightful briefings this morning. Mr. President, this year's report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence informs of the worrying trends of sexual violence across the world. In many situations, including my own country, Myanmar, civilians were exposed to higher levels of sexual violence as a result of the collapse of the rule of law and the escalation of the conflict following unconstitutional changes of government. Patterns of sexual violence deepened. Sexual violence continued to be used as a deliberate tactic of war. It was also used as part of political violence to intimidate and punish opponents. Impunity remained pervasive. Mr. President, it has long been documented and well known to the United Nations that Myanmar military uses sexual violence such as rape and gang rape during conflicts as a tactic of war. After the illegal military coup in February 2021, the security and police forces under the direct control of the illegitimate military junta have been using sexual violence systematically as a tactic of war, political oppression, intimidation, and retaliation. The CSO representative, Ms. Hser from Myanmar, informed the Council of the true and devastating situation in Myanmar, especially heartbreaking situation that women and girls are facing. Taking this opportunity, I wish to thank and salute Ms. Hser and all women human rights defenders for their tireless efforts and bravery for protecting women and girls and promoting their rights. While echoing what Ms. Hser said earlier this morning, I wish to appeal that please do not kill and harm people by aiming or supporting the military junta. Mr. President, clearly and sadly, the people of Myanmar, particularly women and girls, are facing severe suffering caused by the military junta. I have repeatedly informed this Council and the General Assembly that the violence and atrocities being committed by the military junta since the coup are not isolated incidents. They are so widespread, targeted, and systematic that the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, IIMM, concluded that they could amount to crimes against humanity and war crimes. I appreciate the Secretary General and SRSG Patten for rightly listing Myanmar militaries, including its border guard, in this year's report's list of parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of rape or other forms of sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. On the other hand, the National Unity Government of Myanmar, in line with the Federal Democracy Charter, has taken a people-centered approach to advance the women, peace, and security agenda through civic actors. The NUG has been doing its best in every way to make sure its people defense forces adhering to the rule of engagement and to the international humanitarian and human rights law. Mr. President, women and girls in Myanmar, particularly in conflict areas, need protection from the military sexual violence. The survivor deserve justice. The junta is unwilling to address sexual violence being committed by its personnel. Instead, they maintain a culture of impunity among the rank and file. To put an end to these heinous crimes of sexual violence in Myanmar, we must transform the military institution from the main sexual violence perpetrator to a professional and accountable institution that is subject to the rule of law and democratic oversight, as well as federal democratic norms and principles. This is a key goal of our ongoing revolution against this military dictatorship in Myanmar. I agree with and endorse the demands made this morning by CSO representative Ms. Hser for the further action of the Security Council. In addition, I wish to make the following appeal. It is important that the UN system continue to work with and support women-led organizations, women CSO leaders, and human rights defenders in monitoring and documenting the sexual violence situation in Myanmar and assisting the survivors through every possible way. All individual member states should support Myanmar women, among others, by giving protection to those who fled the junta's atrocities and by supporting women-led organizations and initiatives. The Security Council should give serious attention to the situation of women and girls in Myanmar, especially in conflict-affected areas. It should demand an immediate end to sexual violence being committed by the military. More importantly, Council should take concrete actions to end the military impunity. These specific demands should be included in a follow-up enforceable resolution to the Council Resolution 2669. As such, I wish to urge the members of the UN Security Council to start now a negotiation process to adopt timely and enforceable resolution on Myanmar. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Myanmar for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Cyprus.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the British Presidency of the UN Security Council for the timely organization of this meeting on the important issue of CRSV, as well as the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict for her insightful presentation. We reiterate our full support to her mandate. We also congratulate the members of the civil society who made invaluable contributions today. Mr. President, my delegation fully subscribes to the statement delivered by the European Union. I would like to make some additional remarks in my national capacity. Cyprus strongly condemns gender-based violence in all its forms and manifestations, online and offline, including all acts of sexual violence against civilians in armed conflicts. Despite progress made since the unanimous adoption of Resolution 1820 of the Security Council in 2008, the abhorrent crime of conflict-related sexual violence continues, and impunity regrettably prevails in many cases. Victims and survivors are often living ashamed in the shadow, awaiting justice and redress. We are deeply concerned by the growing use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism, including by the severity and brutality of such incidents. Numbers cannot lie and are only the tip of the iceberg, since many cases remain unreported. These heinous CRSV crimes can be facilitated and promoted also online, utilizing digital channels. We note with concern that women and girls, constituting the majority of the CRSV victims, are disproportionately affected by the gender-digital divide. Cyprus recalls that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute a war crime, a crime against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. CRSV is a peace and security issue and an impediment to restoration of peace, requiring specific operational and policy responses. These heinous crimes should not remain unanswered and cannot be addressed in isolation. Member States have obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It is their responsibility to prevent and address such violence, to protect and support survivors and bring perpetrators to justice. In this regard, Cyprus joins others in calling all parties to armed conflicts, including non-state armed groups, to cease acts of sexual violence immediately and completely against civilians, and to implement action plans to prevent and address sexual violence in accordance with their obligations under international humanitarian law and all the relevant Security Council resolutions. Prosecution and accountability are keys to ensuring long-lasting peace. Therefore, we need to strengthen legal procedures at national, regional, and international levels, ensuring that all victims of sexual violence, particularly women and girls, have equal protection under the law and equal access to justice. Addressing the culture of impunity is our common responsibility. The international community has also an obligation to ensure accountability for such crimes when national institutions are unable or unwilling to do so. The Security Council must use all tools at its disposal to support action against CRSV as a tactic of war. A survivor-centered approach must guide all our actions and responses to CRSV. We should always take into consideration that survivors are not a homogeneous group. They have different needs and perspectives that we need to take into consideration in addressing the trauma that victims, survivors, and their families are experiencing, including by ensuring access to medical care and psychosocial support. Mr. President, as a country that has experienced the atrocity of CRSV firsthand, Cyprus attaches great importance to the elimination of all forms of gender-based violence and joins calls to accelerate efforts towards their elimination. In this regard, Cyprus has adopted action plans and strategies related to gender equality, including legislative measures highlighting and promoting the positive role women have as agents of change. Mr. President, it is imperative to address the root causes of sexual violence in conflict settings and of gender-based violence, deeply rooted in historical inequalities which perpetuate the problem. In this regard, the full, equal, and meaningful participation and involvement of women in all efforts for the maintenance of peace and security is a sine qua non for the full implementation of the peace and security agenda, including in addressing CRSV. To conclude, Cyprus remains committed to continue working with the international community to strengthen the global response to CRSV in order to protect and empower women, girls, men, and boys in all their diversity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Cyprus for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يتمنى وفد بلادي التوفيق لوفد المملكة المتحدة في ترأس أعمال المجلس لهذا الشهر، والشكر موصول كذلك لدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة الشقيقة لنجاح رئاستها للشهر الماضي. كما أتوجه بالشكر للسيدة براميلا باتن ممثل الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة على تقريرها. سيد الرئيس، كان العراق من أوائل الدول على المستوى العربي استجابة لوضع خطة وطنية لتنفيذ القرار 1325 بغية تحقيق المشاركة الفاعلة والهادفة للنساء. يود وفد بلادي بيان عدد من الإجراءات الحكومية ذات الصلة. أولاً، لقد أتاح النظام الانتخابي لعام 2021 للمرأة من الدخول بقوة في الانتخابات، وحظيت بعضوية 97 امرأة بعضوية البرلمان، متجاوزة حصة المرأة من الكوتا النسائية. ثانياً، إطلاق الاستراتيجية الوطنية للمرأة العراقية للأعوام 2023-2030 التي تتضمن محاور المشاركة والحماية والتمكين الاقتصادي ومحاور اجتماعية أخرى. ثالثاً، استحداث مراكز الحماية من العنف المنزلي، والعمل جاري على إعداد تعليمات موحدة كبيرة لتنظيم عمل هذه المراكز. 4. العمل على ضمان الملاحقة القضائية للجنات مرتكبي جرائم العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنساء، وعدم التسامح معهم مطلقاً، إذ جرى استثنائهم من أي عفو يصدر. 5. فيما يتعلق بالتقدم المحرز في تنفيذ قانون تعويض الناجيات الأيزيديات، باشرت حكومة العراق عملها في بناء قاعدة بيانات عن النساء والفتيات ممن شملهن القانون، وأطلقت مديرية الناجيات منذ شهر آذار الماضي هذا العام أول دفعة من الرواتب للناجيات، والعمل جاري لإدراج الباقين. سادساً، إصدار ما يقارب من 72,000 وثيقة وطنية للنساء والأطفال في المناطق المحررة وللنازحين كذلك. 7. تعمل المديرية العامة لشؤون الناجيات على تفعيل نظام إحالة مع 10 منظمات تعمل في مجال الدعم النفسي والاجتماعي بغية تقديم خدمات الدعم النفسي والاجتماعي للناجيات وإعادة تأهيلهن وإدماجهن في المجتمع. 8. في إطار مساعي العراق الحثيثة في معالجة آثار تنظيم داعش الإرهابي واستكمال تحقيق العدالة للضحايا وذويهم، وضرورة ألا يأخذ التحقيق مسار العدالة مديات طويلة مما يسهم في إفلات الجنات من العقاب ويمس في جوهر تحقيق مفهوم العدالة، يؤكد وفد بلادي هنا على أهمية وضرورة تسليم فريق التحقيق اليونيتات الأدلة كافة التي أكد على الانتهاء منها إلى القضاء العراقي بموجب ولايته وشروط الاختصاص للمضي قدما في محاكمة المتهمين بشكل كامل وعادل وشفاف وبدون تأخير. سيد الرئيس، ختاما، في الوقت الذي ندين فيه جميع الجرائم البشعة التي ارتكبها تنظيم داعش الإرهابي، إلا أننا لا نؤيد استغلال التقرير الأخير للأمين العام في استخدام عبارات غير مناسبة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Iraq for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Namibia.
Mr. President, Namibia thanks you for organizing this open debate on women, peace, and security. As a champion of the women, peace, and security agenda, we are, as always, encouraged by the overwhelming support for this open debate. Conflict-related sexual violence is a serious and abhorrent crime that implies a collective moral obligation and provokes a sense of urgency. Therefore, it's concerning that despite this Council adopting resolutions that recognize CRSV as a tactic of war and terrorism, it persists and in some settings has even increased, with impunity remaining the norm. CRSV occurs on a continuum of interrelated and recurring forms of violence against women and girls. The consequences for victims and their communities are both immediate and long-term. It not only violates the human rights of its victims, but also devastates families and communities, with the impacts of these crimes echoing across generations, manifested through gender inequalities, trauma, stigma, poverty, and poor health and well-being. In Africa, this greatly impacts our potential to harness the demographic dividend as it impedes the potential of women and girls. Impunity results in children and young girls learning that sexual violence is acceptable and regressive violent customs and practices reappear. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2467 recalls that it is the responsibilities of states to end impunity and to prosecute those responsible for crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes perpetrated against civilians, including CRSV. In seeking to bridge the existing implementation gaps, we must ensure gender mainstreaming in peacekeeping and peace building, sensitize participating in peacekeeping missions on gender issues, and ensure that gender sensitization is part of the preparation of troops and police who are participating in peacekeeping missions, advocate for more women to be included in peacekeeping missions at all levels of decision-making and peacekeeping process, ensure that personnel being deployed to conflict areas are aware of the causes of conflict and effective strategies of conflict management, and ensure that measures are in place to hold members of peacekeeping forces accountable to the commission of CRSV or other violations such as sexual exploitation, rape, or other forms of gender-based violence. The Women, Peace and Security agenda was born out of a need to promote women's participation in efforts and processes aimed at pursuing peace and security, the prevention of all forms of violence against women and girls, and the protection of women in conflict and non-conflict situations, as well as the need to situate women not only as victims, but also as key actors in the development of gender-responsive peace and security policies and programming. As we continue to drive forward action on women, peace and security and CRSV, we must ensure that the rights and needs of sexual violence survivors are at the heart of response efforts and interventions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Namibia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express appreciation to the UK presidency for the leadership in bringing this important issue to the forefront of today's discussions. We also thank the UN Secretary General for his recent latest report. Georgia aligned with the statement of the European Union made earlier today, and I would like to make these additional comments in my personal capacity, in my national capacity. Unfortunately, sexual violence continues to be used as a strategy of warfare and a tactic of terror, shattering lives and scarring communities, which is often presented in military conflicts and has an immense impact on innocent civilians. This horrendous crime affects all people, though it disproportionately impacts women and girls. We are concerned over the findings of the Secretary General's report on violations in several countries. We condemn the documented cases of sexual violence and of using it as a method of torture by the Russian forces and Russian-affiliated armed groups in Ukraine. Excellencies, evidence from the research and practice shows that conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war, and it can be prevented. Eliminating sexual violence during conflict must be a priority for the international community. It can be prevented by strengthening national and international efforts, raising awareness and ensuring justice. The adoption of the UN Security Council resolutions on conflict-related sexual violence paved the way for states to establish a firm normative framework that can address the CRSV as an issue of peace and security. With this in mind, the government of Georgia joined the 50-plus states at the London Conference on the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict last year, endorsing the declaration which aims to urgently accelerate action to end conflict-related sexual violence, hold those responsible to account, shatter the existing culture of impunity, provide more comprehensive support to survivors, and tackle stigma. Here, let me use this occasion to commend the UK for the successful conduct of this substantial conference. Furthermore, at the conference, Georgia undertook also national commitments outlining the steps to address conflict-related sexual violence through contributing to the strengthened global response, undertaking policies and programs to tackle the harmful gender norms that drive sexual violence, strengthening justice for the CRSV, and supporting survivors and children born as a result of CRSV. Moreover, promotion of the women's rights and gender equality, including in the military, remains among top priorities of my government. Gender equality strategy of the Ministry of Defense of Georgia establishes the conditions required to guarantee equal rights, freedoms, and opportunities for men and women, prevent and eradicate all forms of discrimination, counter any kind of gender violence, and eliminate the misconduct, sexual harassment, and physical and psychological mistreatment. The Georgian Ministry of Defense also continues with efforts to increase capacity of peacekeeping personnel on preventing and responding to sexual and gender-based violence, including in conflict and post-conflict situations. All peace mission deployed personnel are trained on the UNSC resolutions on women, peace, and security in the frame of mandatory pre-deployment trainings. Let me mention herewith that in October 2022, the Georgian government adopted subsequent national action plan on the implementation of the UN resolutions 1325 on women, peace, and security for 2022-2024. However, the illegal occupation of the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and Skhinvali region, South Ossetia, by the Russian Federation remains the main obstacle for the Georgian government to implement the human rights protection framework for the women and girls, remaining on the other side of the illegally erected barbed wire fences, who are systematically subjected to human rights violations, including the denial of the right to freedom of movement, threats to physical security for the so-called illegal border crossing, and illegal detentions. Recently, there has been an extremely worrisome pattern observed increasingly targeting the Georgian women. The outrageous practice of illegal detentions is being used as an instrument of terror against one of the most vulnerable groups. International engagement and monitoring of the situation inside the conflict-affected regions and the Russia-occupied regions of Georgia in particular is therefore a paramount to ensure substantive gender equality and prevent the sexual violence against women. Thank you.
The representative of Georgia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.